Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Spaceflight Now's live coverage of the latest mission from Starbase, Texas, along the U.S.-Mexico border. You're looking live at the 13th integrated Starship Super Heavy rocket that SpaceX is aiming to launch at the opening of a 90-minute window that begins at 5:45 p.m. Central, 6:45 p.m. Eastern, 22:45 UTC for those joining around the world. This is SpaceX's second main attempt to launch the Starship Flight 13 mission after a post-ignition abort just a little more than a week ago forced them to stand down and conduct some engine work back at the production site. But as you can see, both the booster and the upper stage have rolled back out to the pad, been integrated. And now SpaceX says they are tracking towards the opening of that 90-minute window. Currently T-minus 1 hour, 57 minutes, 35 seconds and counting to the planned liftoff of this Starship rocket. And we're glad that you're here along with us. I'm Will Robinson-Smith, reporter with Spaceflight Now. It's good to be with you here on this Friday, July 24th, as SpaceX is taking another bite at the apple at launching the Flight 13 mission. Sending now back to Starbase as we continue to watch the progress of the launch vehicle standing there at the pad, preparing to fly with 20 V3 Starlink satellites on board. The first time that SpaceX is launching the version 3 iteration of its Starlink satellites. Now, this is not an orbital mission that will come on a future launch. The V3 Starlinks on board will follow the same suborbital trajectory as the upper stage of the launch vehicle and will demise less than a half hour following deployment. As we're getting going here this evening, I want to thank the more than 1,300 of you who are watching along with us live today. If you haven't already, you could do us a big favor just by clicking the like button here on the stream and sharing it as well. Allow some more folks to find their way into our live launch coverage. These views at the moment brought to us by our friends over at Avid Space, formerly Lab Padre, but as was the case during the last launch attempt and throughout the course of the week, our Adam Bernstein has been steadfastly remaining in the Starbase area and has been capturing sights and sounds around the manufacturing and testing complex as we've been preparing for today's coverage of the Starship Flight 13 mission, attempt number 2. Taking a live look at his camera view from South Padre Island, looking south at Starbase from a safe viewing distance with some elevation to be able to track the rocket once it does take to the skies, if it does take to the skies today. Our Spaceflight Now editor, Stephen Young, is running the technical operations of this broadcast alongside our John Pisani. And as was the case with the last launch attempt, we will be joined by a host of wonderful guests throughout the course of our broadcast coverage today. Throughout the course of the coverage, we'll have those guests joining at various intervals so that we can have good and robust conversations about all aspects of this mission and broader implications of Starship Flight 13 beyond just SpaceX's bottom line and its own ambitions. Here's a look at the lineup that we've got on tap for you today. We've got Jeff Foust, senior staff writer over at Space News, Joey Roulette, space reporter over at Reuters, and Stephen Clark, space reporter at Ars Technica, former editor here at Spaceflight Now. So they'll be joining our coverage in due course. So we hope you stick around for the duration of the broadcast as we'll have them at varying times. So you'll want to be here as we have those good conversations to talk about all things space, SpaceX, and Starship. In addition to all the aforementioned folks, I want to thank our moderators in the live chat as well, who are helping to keep things kosher in the chat. So big thanks to Jeff Hansen, M. Teresa, holding it down at the moment. If you do see any of the other mods cruise on in throughout the course of the coverage, be sure to give them a big old spaceflight now hello. You can help make the mods' job that much easier just by following our live chat rules. We ask that you please post your message in English so that the mods can respond as appropriate. Also, that you hold off from delving into topics of overt politics or religion, and please do not use all caps. Emojis are perfectly fine. We just ask that you not create a huge block of them so it takes up a large chunk of the live chat space. And last but certainly not least, we ask that you treat each other with the kindness and respect that you yourself would like to be treated. We'll all get along swimmingly. We're also joined in the chat this afternoon, cruising into the evening, by one of our channel members, Cumulus Granatus, who's able to help answer folks' questions in the chat as we go throughout this 2-hour pre-launch coverage and, of course, throughout the course of the mission itself, assuming SpaceX is able to get it off the ground today. Speaking of channel members, they make this and every other live launch opportunity possible here at Spaceflight Now. So big thanks to folks like Mark P., U.S. Army Wife, William Funk, Mandy L., Pie Guy, Cobra Emergency, and many, many others. Channel membership comes with a number of perks, including discounts at our online shop, which is shop.spaceflightnow.com, access to member-only videos here on YouTube, and access to our members-only Discord server. To that end, I want to welcome in our 5 newest gifted members, courtesy of pre-existing channel member Quentin Kirby. So to our newest gifted members, welcome aboard. We're glad to have you with us. If you haven't already, be sure to thank Quentin in the live chat. And we hope you decide to stick around with the channel membership you were just gifted beyond that gifted month. Last little bit of housekeeping as we get things rolling here today. If you have a comment or question about this mission or other goings-on in the realm of space or spaceflight, or you have a question for our guests as they join us throughout the course of the coverage, we'll have our folks in the back keeping an eye on the chat as we're chatting with our guests. So while I keep the conversation going, if some questions come in explicitly for them, again, assuming, like with all of our live super chats, if it's appropriate to be asked, we'd love to make you a part of the broadcast here. So getting things started, want to thank Virginia Ramirez for both a $10 and a $2 super chat, one of our channel members. Thank you, Virginia. And a thank you to PepMets, also for a $10 super chat, who says, thanks for your coverage. Your style is similar to NASA's George Diller from Space Shuttle coverage, which I enjoyed. Information without going over the top. Continued success. Well, that is very high praise and very kind words, so thank you. Just about an hour and 15 minutes remaining on the clock. Again, the time you see there on the upper right-hand corner of the screen is counting down to the opening of today's 90-minute window. So if SpaceX does change the T0 at some point, we will, of course, adjust our countdown clock. But for now, SpaceX says they are tracking towards liftoff at the first possible launch opportunity. As we saw with the previous attempt to launch Starship Flight 13, if SpaceX does run into some issue during the final minute of the countdown, they do have the opportunity to hold the count at T-minus 60 seconds and keep that hold in place depending on the issue, of course. They can maintain that hold for the better part of about 10 minutes and then recycle the count. That is different from SpaceX Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy rocket launch, where in employing the super cold densified liquid oxygen for those comparatively smaller rockets, SpaceX does not have the ability to hold the countdown once fueling has begun. The tank farm there down at Starbase has been active throughout the latter part of the afternoon here as teams have been conditioning the liquid oxygen and the liquid methane in preparation for loading it onboard Starship and Super Heavy. The tanking timeline for Starship has changed over the course of the previous dozen integrated test flights. With this mission, they will start with loading liquid oxygen first on the ship upper stage, then the booster. Then they will continue on with loading the liquid methane, the fuel for the booster, and then proceed to fuel load on the ship upper stage. Given the stainless steel skin of the rocket, both the liquid methane and liquid oxygen will produce a very helpful frost line showing you a rough percentage of those tanks that have been filled as they do get loaded up with their respective LOX and methane. The fueling process is going to begin in earnest in just a little under an hour's time from now. The SpaceX flight director giving the go-ahead for the start of tanking at around the 50-minute mark, and then again the ship LOX load will kick things off at about T-minus 37 minutes and 30 seconds. Time now T minus 1 hour, 42 minutes, 26 seconds in counting. Again, we are still tracking the upcoming Flight 13 mission for SpaceX with its Starship Super Heavy launch vehicle set to lift off at the opening of a 90-minute window. And we did mention that we have a number of guests lined up for you as part of our launch coverage, and we do want to bring in the first of those right now. Joining us from Space News, the senior reporter over there, Mr. Jeff Foust, is joining us from the Washington, D.C. area. Jeff, it's good to speak with you. Hope you've had a good week, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Will, for the invitation. Great to be on.
Great to have you and your expertise, since there's obviously a lot been happening with SpaceX since the last time they launched Starship. They've had an initial public offering. They've been trading stock for a while. There's been updates on SpaceX's involvement with the Artemis 3 mission. So we're glad to have you and your perspective as part of the broadcast. Before we get into the policy and the politics from the Hill, with Starship Flight 13, you and I haven't had a chance to really catch up on Starship since the Artemis 3 crew was announced. So, starting off more of at a high level perspective, what are you most keying into with this launch, and what are you watching for to see how well it does or does not work?
Yeah, I think the key thing is to see if the issues they encountered on Flight 12 in May have been corrected, with the engine issues, with the wrong orientation of the flip of the super heavy booster at separation, the problems that caused, because they really need to check those items off before they can demonstrate they're ready to go to orbital flight. And that's critical, both for SpaceX's own ambitions for deploying Starlink version 3 satellites, but also for the Artemis program and demonstrating they can get Starship into orbit and do some propellant transfer demonstrations, and leading up obviously to the Artemis 3 mission in about a year.
Yeah, and obviously NASA closely watching this mission since, as they mentioned earlier this year, it's essentially a version 3 iteration of Starship with a docking adapter that will be flying on the Artemis 3 mission. So not too dissimilar from what we're about to see today with the addition of that docking adapter. Obviously, having a Raptor relight is going to be really important to be able to station keep as Orion approaches that. Earlier this week, as a matter of fact, I believe it was actually just yesterday, the Government Accountability Office had their own report talking about a number of NASA missions it's undertaking, including the Artemis 3 and beyond missions. Were concerned Starship and HLS, was this essentially sort of in line with what you expected a GAO to say at this point, where they had concerns considering things like the Raptor engines and cryo transfer?
Yeah, I think that's sort of expected to see in terms of their concerns that they've raised. One of the challenges for GAO is that, the Artemis 3 plans are a moving target, and that they changed over the course of the report, as they did, that Artemis 3 became the Earth orbit rendezvous and docking demonstration mission rather than a lunar landing mission as originally planned. So they've had to adapt to that and the changes in the architecture, which itself obviously is still in flux as both Blue Origin and SpaceX work on their lunar landers. But I think it made clear that SpaceX still has a lot to demonstrate in order to be able to carry out Artemis 3 or the future lunar landing missions, which makes today's launch so important in terms of demonstrating the progress that they have made in terms of correcting problems with the vehicle and showing that they're ready to take the next step, which is an orbital flight.
Yeah, and about a month or so ago, the COO Gwen Shotwell told CNBC that potentially, depending on how this flight goes, they might try an orbital launch with Flight 14. Do you think that that's still within the realm of possibility if everything goes as planned today, or do you think there might still be some things that they'll want to wring out before sending Starship orbital with the next go round?
I think if they have a really successful flight here with Flight 13, I think they would be, as Gwen Shotwell mentioned earlier, move on to an orbital flight attempt. There's only so many more things you can demonstrate on a suborbital flight before going orbital, and so I think that would be the next major step and something that they would attempt as soon as Flight 14, assuming all goes well today.
And calling to my colleague Stephen in the background, if you can ready video 5 for us. Before or during the Artemis 3 announcement, we had an opportunity to have a number of conversations, as you were as well, Jeff, and talk to some of the players involved with that mission, including over at the Human Landing System office. And I want to bring up a clip from that here, where we had the chance to talk with Steve Creech, the program manager at HLS, to talk about some of the timelines that at that point were the roadmap for the next couple of big things that are coming in 2026, 7, and 8. So let's go ahead and play this sound, and we'll talk about it on the other side, Jeff.
For both Blue Origin and SpaceX, we're expecting critical design review next year. They're both into fabrication. Of course, SpaceX is building Starships. They have not started. You will see later this year, they're actually starting building the next test that they will do for us. We call it propellant transfer demo. Well, they'll launch one Starship up and then launch another one to chase it and actually demonstrate transferring propellant in orbit. So that, and then later this year, earlier next year, they'll be building the actual uncrewed demo vehicles, which we're expecting in 27. Blue Origin is just starting production. They're again pretty mature in their design, and they're actually now starting production of the test article for Artemis 3 and the uncrewed demo hardware, literally this month.
Gotcha. And for the uncrewed landing demonstrations, obviously those would happen sometime after all of the final fabrication is done. Would that be in, I guess, the back half of 2027 for both, or is that still being fleshed out?
Yeah, we're targeting end of 27, early 28 for both of those. We're expecting right now SpaceX will be in the end of 27 and Blue Origin will be the beginning of 2028 to do that uncrewed demo mission.
And so, Jeff, bringing you back in here, a lot of dates, a lot of goals that the HLS office has in mind. From all the reporting that you've done on the Artemis program in HLS, how feasible do you feel like all of those are to keep that track that NASA wants to maintain towards ideally launching the Artemis 4 landing mission in 2028?
Yeah, that is a pretty aggressive schedule in terms of what SpaceX has to achieve in the upcoming launches, getting to orbit, doing propellant transfer demonstrations, flying the Artemis 3 mission, doing that uncrewed landing demo that Steve Creech mentioned in late 2027, and NASA is still talking about doing Artemis 4 in early 2028. So that's a pretty tight timeline, and obviously some things are probably going to slip. Inevitably, there are going to be some issues that come up at various stages in that timeline that's going to push back some of those timelines. So I don't think we'll see Artemis 4 in early 2028. It would be good to get it in sometime in 2028, whether that is flown with Starship or whether that's flown with Blue Moon. But it's a tight timeline that we've seen. We've looked at with Artemis 2, we saw lots of delays in just getting the Orion spacecraft ready. So I would not be surprised if we see some more delays coming up with the landers, given the separate challenges that SpaceX and Blue Origin are facing with their development.
Yeah, and as we just heard about with Blue Origin today, that they've shifted some of their New Glenn upper stage tests from where they used to have it over at part of the Launch Complex 36 site. Now they're moving over to a test stand at the Stennis Space Center in Mississippi, which is not too far away from Michoud if folks have had the opportunity to go down to either one of those sites off of the I-10 area in the southeast. But obviously there's a lot in flux when it comes to the two lander providers. We've heard time and time again, Jeff, that Dave Limp over at Blue has been, wanting to keep the company on track to bring that rocket back to bear by the end of this year. From what we've been hearing and seeing how they're moving, does that feel more realistic at this stage in their bounce back to the flights with New Glenn versus in the more immediate aftermath of the explosion?
It seems a little bit more realistic now than say a month ago, simply because it seemed like that the pad cleanup task would be something that would take months, and it was something that they ended up completing in weeks. And so I think they are moving much more quickly than most people imagined at this point. Obviously, there is still a lot of work to do. There's obviously it's not just the pad cleanup, but it's also the investigation into what went wrong with the static fire and the explosion, and what that means for the vehicle, the BE4 engines, any sort of redesign that is needed to accommodate that, so they could be in a position where the pad is ready, but the rocket is not. But that's a little different position than even just a few weeks ago when it seemed less likely that either would be ready by the end of the year.
Yeah, it's certainly trying to get that back and activated is still a tall task ahead of them, but like you said, it sounds like they're making good headway. It's within the realm of the possible, I suppose, at this point. And obviously what we've heard from the administrator is that they really want to keep the pedal on when it comes to both of the lander options as they exist for the Artemis 3 mission, to make sure that that flight, if it still can happen mid-27, stays in that pocket. I've not heard of any additional potential slips to Artemis 3 as it currently is architected. Have you heard of anything in that regard, or from what you're reporting, is it sticking pretty much to mid-year?
Right now, I think they're still focused on flying in the middle of next year, and it's not so much sort of the SLS Orion EGS. That's all seems to be going very well. They're stacking parts of the vehicle right now. They're making a lot of progress there. That's not going to be the critical path to the launch. The critical path is going to be the availability of the SpaceX and Blue Origin landers that Orion will meet up with on that mission. So I think they're still focused on a mid-2027 launch. I think NASA's approach is to be aggressive and push as hard as they can to try and make that. Obviously, if you don't think you're going to make mid-2027, you're not. If you try to make mid-2027, you're at least keeping that option open, and perhaps minimizing the delays that you might otherwise face.
Looking a little bit further into the future, want to go to some of your reporting from earlier this week, Jeff, in which you had talked about comments from Artemis 2 pilot Victor Glover and his feeling that the landing site for some of these early Artemis missions, while NASA themselves is pretty intent on the South Pole, and you had some great quotes from some of the leadership saying that is still their focus and their intent is to have their crewed landers arrive at the South Pole, which is of great scientific and exploration interest. But Victor Glover feels like that may not be the best course. For folks that haven't had the chance to take a look at this article, can you kind of expound on why he feels like that might be a better course for NASA to take?
Yeah, Victor Glover spoke at a conference on Tuesday, the NASA Exploration Science Forum out at the Ames Research Center in California. He was sort of a surprise speaker. He was not listed in the program other than an unnamed special presentation during the course of the day. So he was sort of either a last minute ad or a surprise for the attendees. But he basically did a Q&A with the audience, was primarily scientists working on lunar exploration, and one of them asked him his preferred landing site, where he'd like to go on the moon. And he expressed a desire to go to what he termed more familiar sites, closer to the equator, much like some of the locations that the Apollo missions went to. Because of the challenges of trying to go to the South Polar region. One reason he mentioned was sort of the earlier architectures for that involve using what's called the near rectilinear halo orbit, which is this very elliptical orbit that goes around the moon that enables access to the South Polar region. But the drawback is that once you land, you have to wait almost a week before Orion or the Gateway is back in position for you to lift off. And he said, well, what happens if an astronaut has a ruptured appendix? or they're stuck there. And he says, I didn't really like that plan. Another issue is that landing on the south pole of the moon is challenging. The lighting conditions are difficult. You have, because the sun is low on the horizon, you have long shadows that can complicate navigation. We've seen robotic landers having problems landing there. The two Intuitive Machines missions both tipped over when landing, both in the south polar region of the moon. So we've seen evidence there that it can be difficult to go there. And so he advocated for more of a test pilot approach where you start off, sort of in the easier part of the flight envelope, and then you gradually expand that flight envelope over time as you get used to the lander and its capabilities. And so he was talking about eventually you would want to get to the south polar region of the moon. That remains sort of the goal of NASA. That's where NASA wants to put the moon base they're talking about doing, but maybe you don't go there immediately. And that's not necessarily a new idea that he brought forward. I can remember even Jim Bridenstine, when he was NASA administrator in the first Trump administration, when they were first setting up plans to go to the moon and land in the south polar regions of the moon, suggesting for a time, well, maybe the first landing shouldn't go to the south polar region of the moon. Maybe it should go someplace else. That it was sort of a trial balloon that he floated that didn't last very long. But the idea that maybe you don't immediately go to the South Pole has has some weight, at least with one prominent member of the astronaut corps. And if you're trying to get to the moon quickly, there's a lot of risks you're going to take. Maybe there are ways you can minimize some of those risks by finding an easier landing site. So we'll see. But as you mentioned, NASA officials at the meeting and elsewhere have emphasized they're still going to the South Polar region of the moon, but they have not committed to an exact location at the South Polar region for Artemis 4 or Artemis 5.
Yeah, and if you want to bring it to an even more recent set of concerns beyond just Victor Glover, I mean, the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel also had a written report in which they made comments concerning the landing site or the landing potential of Starship at the South Pole, mentioning a number of the things that you just brought up, Jeff, the lighting conditions, the rocky terrain, the fact that you've got such a great distance between where the crew would be situated at the top of Starship versus where the landing legs would be all the way down, several dozens of meters below. So a lot of complicated dynamics at play for the Artemis 4 mission. And on top of that, while engineers are working through this process right now, the uncrewed landing demonstration, as it's laid out, also doesn't involve a test of the elevator system that would be used to bring astronauts to the surface and then back up, which obviously is a critical component that has to work. Or, we certainly haven't heard publicly what the fallback would be if it didn't work. And, I imagine that would be easier to ring out in an equatorial landing versus the South Pole, right?
Yeah, that's a major design issue, and I imagine the astronaut corps is very interested and very invested in what sort of backup scenarios that they have if the elevator malfunctions on Starship. But that's sort of a key design issue as well, and again, it gets to the point of minimizing the risk of that first landing. What can you do to increase the odds of mission success and obviously getting the crew back safely? So those are all issues that are being considered. And like I said, we heard this week from an astronaut, maybe speaking for himself, maybe perhaps speaking for some of the other members of the astronaut corps with their concerns about the current architecture for Artemis.
Maybe a little bit too much of a crystal ball question, but it was about a year out from when the Artemis 3 mission is set to fly that we learned the names of the Artemis 3 crew. Given that Artemis 4 is set to launch in 2028, do you think that early next year we'll hear that quartet of names announced? Or do you think that given the complexity of an Artemis 4 mission, once a lander is ultimately selected, that they may have a bit of a longer training timeline just because there's so much that they need to get their arms around when it comes to, actually setting boots on the moon?
That's a really good point because we don't know with Artemis 4 what lander they'll use. Will it be Starship? Will it be Blue Moon Mark 2? Uh, and obviously, the training regime is going to be different if they're flying Starship versus Blue Moon Mark 2, and they may not know exactly when they are what lander they would be using until after Artemis 3. Depending on the results of that, and so that presents something of a complication for crew selection and the timeline for doing so. Uh, and then obviously they will require training not just on Orion and the Starship or Blue Moon, but also on what they're going to do on the lunar surface. What sort of, the equipment they'll be using, the scientific, you know, experiments they're going to be carrying out, sample collection, all sorts of things like that over the course of the mission. And so if we get to early 2027 and we haven't had a crew announce, that would suggest that a landing in the first part of 2028 is unlikely simply given the training time needed. Now you can do some background training for all of the astronauts being considered for landing missions to help cover some of that, but the mission specific training is going to be pretty complex because you're going to have to deal with Orion, you're going to have to deal with the lander, you're going to have to deal with the science and other activities you're doing on the lunar surface. So I'm not sure that's something that you can easily compress into say 12 months or so.
Yeah, and I have to imagine, obviously, the lunar, science team can pretty much be a little bit agnostic when it comes to figuring out the broad scope of the science. But, to your point, when it comes to training the crew of specifically, how to handle samples, where to go, what to look for, especially as it concerns the geography of the moon and whether you're talking about an equatorial landing versus a South Pole landing, I imagine there are going to be some critical differences if you're asking a crew to go into a permanently shadowed region of the moon versus somewhere that only sees darkness when it's a lunar nighttime, and so that may create some variances as well. Do you think that because of that there are some certain characteristics among the astronaut office that they're going to want to kind of pare down to, maybe make sure that they have a geologist among the crew, or do you think that that's a little bit too inside baseball to even start to contemplate
Yeah,
that
I
at this
think I
point?
think it's a little difficult right now to sort of determine exactly what the right crew makeup is going to be. Obviously, I think scientists would love to have a geologist or someone with a geology related background on that mission. Obviously, you're going to want someone who is probably a test pilot who can handle the lander in case the automated flying modes don't work and you need to take over manual control. So those are other factors that weigh into the crew selection process. So it gets a little challenging to try and figure out all that out. But then you don't have to do all the science on the first landing mission. You're going to have, if NASA's plans work out, many, many more landing missions to come. And so if the science maybe is a little curtailed on Artemis 4, you can do more on Artemis 5 and beyond once you get a better handle on the actual process of getting to and from the surface of the moon.
Absolutely. And, I just looking at the clock and want to be respectful of your time, Jeff. So, gonna have to let you go in the next few minutes. But before you do, bringing things back to the mission here, given the turnaround time from when SpaceX had the hard abort post ignition and the handful of days that it took for them to reconcile with that, bring out some engines, put them back in, get the rocket back to the pad, stack up fuel, and be in a position to launch today. Obviously, they want to have a very aggressive launch cadence with Starship down the road once it becomes an orbital flight vehicle in regular rotation. What do you think that this turnaround says about, as people say, the machine that built the machine, the infrastructure at Starbase, and eventually here in Florida, about what they're potentially capable of doing within this next year to 2 years?
Yeah. They will probably need to do Starship launches on something like a weekly cadence to do the actual propellant transfer and filling of the tanks on the Starship lander to get it ready to go. So, being able to demonstrate that regular cadence of missions and how much of that is going to leverage reusability of either the Super Heavy booster or the ship upper stage remains to be seen. I think obviously they'd like to get the booster reused sooner rather than later. The ship maybe can come a little bit later simply because it's fewer engines that get thrown away on each flight. You can crank those out maybe more quickly. So obviously, reusability in the long term is going to be critical for that. But in the short term, being able to get at least partial reusability of the system is going to help with that flight cadence. So we'll have to see how that goes. But I think, they are, we saw with Falcon 9, how the launch cadence, was relatively slow to begin with and got, faster and faster and faster until, now they're able to launch Falcon 9s on average every 2 to 3 days. So they've demonstrated that high cadence with Falcon. Obviously, that's going to be even more important with Starship.
Yeah, absolutely. And just lastly, before we let you go, Jeff, obviously folks can find your reporting at spacenews.com along with your other colleagues. For folks unaware, Jeff covers, policy of civil space, commercial space. What have you got your eye on sort of in the near-term future, Jeff, from a reporting standpoint?
Well, we're, still working on what NASA's budget is going to be for the next fiscal year, which starts October 1. The administration put forward a budget proposal that sought to cut NASA's budget by nearly 25%. The House has acted to basically rescind that overall cut, although reassign more money to exploration and a little less to science than what the agency received in 2026. We're still waiting on the Senate to offer its bill. They were supposed to have a couple of hearings in the since early June to take up the bill that have been postponed for a number of reasons, which don't have anything to do with NASA, but have to deal with other policy issues and the availability of certain senators. So we're still waiting to see where the Senate is going to weigh in. But that's going to be critical not just for Artemis, but for the agency's plans overall. It's a series of science missions, some of the things that were rolled out in Ignition, like the SR-1 nuclear propulsion demonstration mission, the ramp up of the moon base activities. That's all dependent on sort of what level of funding the agency is able to obtain from NASA. So, that's obviously a big factor to be watching here in the weeks and months to come, although I don't expect any sort of near-term certainty on what NASA's budget levels will be for 2027.
Jeff Foust, Senior Staff Writer for Space News. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Will. It's a pleasure to be on.
Absolutely. Take care. Have a good weekend.
You too.
And our thanks again to Jeff Foust over at Space News for joining us. Time currently T-minus 1 hour, 12 minutes, 42 seconds, and counting to the planned liftoff of the Starship Super Heavy rocket from down at Starbase, Texas, along the U.S.-Mexico border. Taking a look at our live chat here, I want to thank the now more than 3,000 of you who are watching along with us live today. If you haven't already, you could do us a big favor just by clicking that like button and sharing the stream to allow some more folks to find their way into this live launch coverage. Taking a look at the chat as well, Andre, the $10 super chat. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Who says, hi, y'all. Based on the latest available reports, Starship first flight from Florida is expected in the late summer or early fall 2026. Do you have some more precise dates? Well, work is certainly still continuing on with pretty decent fervor over at Launch Complex 39A here at the Kennedy Space Center. We can bring up a live view of that here in just a moment. You can see live out there at the pad right now. The Starship Tower in the center of your screen. The tower for now principally Falcon Heavy launch support there on the left and the hangar off to the right. As Jeff was mentioning, or as we've been tracking, the next Falcon Heavy launch is going to be the flight of NASA's Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope, which is currently set to fly no earlier than August 30th from this pad. As far as the first Starship flight from Florida, it would be from here, although some good progress has been made over the last few weeks over at Space Launch Complex 37 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where the majority of the first of two planned towers has gone up. Don't have a hard and fast date for you on the first launch of a Starship rocket from here. SpaceX says they want to fly before the end of the year. But as far as what you mentioned in your message, I think late summer is certainly most assuredly out of the question. Maybe sometime in the latter couple of months in 2026 if a flight this year is going to happen. I hesitate to put a firm or firmish date on it, but the goal is to fly this year. Earlier today, we did spot some notable venting out at the tank farm here at Launch Complex 39A. So the test work in preparation for the arrival of Starship flight hardware is continuing on with good gusto. So we'll continue to watch, and you can always head over to our 24/7 live stream, Launchpad Live here on YouTube, if you want to keep tabs on what's going on with the Starship Tower there at Launch Complex 39A. Speaking of active Starship launch towers, though, things continue to buzz along here at Pad 2 down at Starbase. This view coming to us from our friends at Avid Space, formerly Lab Padre. And it looks like the tank farm is pretty much right in front of the pad, but to give you a different perspective, here is our Adam Bernstein's vantage point of Starbase from South Padre Island looking down south at Pad 2, and you can see it's a little bit of a distance between where the rocket is standing and where that venting at the tank farm is located. In the slight foreground, just above the horizon, you can see a little bit of the outline of the hopper vehicle that was used for some of the earliest flights out here at Starbase for some of those hop tests. Time now, T minus 1 hour, 5 minutes, 32 seconds, and counting. As we're continuing to monitor the progress of Starship Flight 13. Of course, this is SpaceX's really their second big attempt to launch this mission. Following post-ignition scrub, they had to roll the rocket back to the production site and swap out some engines. You see some video here that was shot by our Adam Bernstein of the vehicle returning to Pad 2. This was late the evening of the 21st that the Super Heavy booster, tail number booster 20, rolled back out to the pad. Had to make a couple of stops and starts along the way. Moving a vehicle of this size is never a perfectly smooth operation, so a couple of hiccups along the roughly 3-mile journey back to the pad, but the vehicle did, of course, make it out there, and they were able to perform a tanking test of Booster 20 prior to stacking the Ship 40 upper stage atop the vehicle the following day. Time now currently T minus 1 hour, 1 minute, 9 seconds and counting to the planned liftoff of Starship Flight 13. No updates from SpaceX at the moment, so presumably teams still trending towards a liftoff of the integrated launch vehicle on the 13th test flight for SpaceX. And not only are we and others from around the world looking at the launch of this flight vehicle, but also folks that are whizzing above us overhead also looking down and watching the progress of Starship Flight 13. A tweet last A little bit from one of the newest members on board the International Space Station, NASA astronaut and former SpaceX employee Neil Menon, sharing a view of Starbase from space, saying, quote, "Here's to a successful launch. Send it." And here to cover what will hopefully be a successful launch is another one of our wonderful guests we have with us now at this point of the broadcast, Mr. Joey Roulette, space reporter over at Reuters. Joey, how are you doing, my friend?
Doing good. How are you, Will?
Good, good. Happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday to you too. Thanks for having me on here.
Absolutely. And there's a lot to talk about when it comes to this mission, where it falls in line with SpaceX and their progress towards getting Starship in an orbital configuration. We started off with our conversation with Jeff Foust asking this, so I'll ask the same to you. Lot to watch with this mission. What is sort of at the top of your list as far as what you're watching to see, whether it goes well and how well it performs?
Yeah, well, so many things, so many objectives, right? I think one of the things that I usually look out for on these flights are how the heat shield does during reentry. But I know that there's a lot of other important objectives that SpaceX wants to meet, such as the booster engines when it's flying back, and the ship engines and how they behave in space, I think is interesting. SpaceX has deployed, as we all know, dummy satellites in the past on missions. The PEZ dispenser seems to be working. This is the first flight technically with real Starlink satellites on board. So how those fare, how those connect to the Starlink network and work out those things will be interesting. I don't know how much SpaceX is going to talk about it on the live stream, but that's just another thing that I'm looking out for.
Yeah, and sticking with the Starlink V3s, like you just mentioned, Joey, last time we saw Starship fly and the time before that, there were the deployment of the simulator Starlink satellites, basically just large hunks of steel meant to simulate the mass and the size of a Starlink. Last time we saw some great visuals of the ship upper stage as one of the final ones went out, and we had that great sort of panoramic view of ship. But we've got this animation that SpaceX shared of one of its V3 Starlink satellites in, presumably this would be one that is on orbit. Obviously, this is not an orbital mission. They'll follow a suborbital trajectory, but you cover both the practicality of SpaceX as well as the business side of SpaceX. So from where you're sitting, how important is it that we're starting to see the actual Starlink V3 minis or Starlink V3 satellites both launch as well as try to connect to the broader constellation?
I mean, I think SpaceX has a lot of satellite experience so far. I'm no engineering expert on the finite details of the specific details of these satellites, but I think one thing I'm looking out for, kind of from a business perspective, is when these satellites are going to reach orbit for the first time. There's some meaningful steps in progress, of course, in what they're going to attempt with today's flight, of course, but a big milestone, I think, is when the V3s get into orbit on Starship specifically. That's the milestone that SpaceX has been, waiting very, very long time for and working a lot towards. So, yeah, I think from a business perspective, it'll signal some, working satellites if they indeed work. I don't expect anything major to go wrong, but this is kind of, I don't know if we've had a kind of testing and developing testing kind of perspective into Starlink satellites like this before, so it'll be interesting. But this is a meaningful step, I think, towards their goal of getting those things in orbit by year's end. So,
and you and your colleagues at Reuters over the years have done a number of good bits of reporting on the Starlink constellation, as well as some of SpaceX's other customers. I'm just thinking of your report on the Starshield partnership between SpaceX and Northrop Grumman. Given the onset of the launch of Starlink V3s that's coming up later this year, how closely do you feel like members of the DoD and its other partners and agencies within the federal government are also watching this type of deployment and thinking about the future applications for government constellations?
For sure, I think many government agencies are watching all of these tests very closely for a number of reasons. SpaceX is pushing the envelope on a lot of different types of systems that are of immense engineering and scientific and programmatic interest to the DoD and to NASA, of course. As far as the Starlink situation goes, I mean, there's obviously some differences between the Starlink V3 constellation and the Starshield satellites in terms of capabilities, of course, and a bunch of other things that we don't know about. But from kind of a networking perspective, an iterative testing perspective, I think this will be very interesting to the government. And I'm not quite sure how much or if at all this existing Starshield constellation for the National Reconnaissance Office connects to the broader Starlink constellation. If there is that kind of connection, which I think there is, but I'm not sure, then there's even more interest in these types of missions and in the stakes of the V3 constellation too. So, yeah, I mean, Starlink is the kind of the powerhouse and the muscle behind SpaceX's satellite chops, of course, and how that, of course, contributes to their behavior and their progress on these military programs. So it's all kind of connected, and I think the government is going to be watching very closely.
Absolutely. A lot of interested parties. And as you were making those comments, Joey, just talking a little bit behind the scenes, it seems like there may be a new T0 forthcoming that the clock is holding at the moment. We're working to see if we can get a new T0 confirmed for the launch. Just for folks' awareness, they do have a 90-minute window with the launch attempt today. So, it's not terribly uncommon, especially given that they did have the post-ignition scrub and abort last time, that they may have some things that they need to work through now that they've got the fully integrated rocket back at the pad. We'll, of course, let you know when we have some more information on this. We're working behind the scenes to see if we can get some more color onto this. But, Joey, just keeping with what we do know about this mission at this point in time, going back to your earlier comments about the heat shield and the need for its performance to continually improve, it seems like from what SpaceX has said going into this launch that they've, unlike some previous flights, they're not leaving holes intentionally in the heat shield. They're not flying a lot of experimental tiles as they have before. You put the pieces of what they've laid out together with what's been inside the Starship docuseries and the reporting that you've done. Does it feel like they're close-ish or fairly close to being sort of set in with the heat shield, or do you feel like there's still quite a long ways to go before they really have something that they're confident in saying, yes, we've got a reusable upper stage?
Yeah. Well, I think a big benchmark would be when they actually reuse a heat shield, right? Which has not happened yet. And that'll be really interesting to see how these heat shield tiles survive a second time under these intense friction conditions. But yeah, I mean, if you watch these videos, SpaceX definitely portrays that there's progress going on. I think it's interesting that they kind of highlight the engineering challenges that a lot of companies don't usually like to talk about. And yeah, I think, it's just going to require the good old SpaceX way of testing over and over again and seeing how it fares on a repeat basis. If we, watching these Starship missions, 12 of them so far, it's kind of remarkable to see how well the whole structure fares after each flight. I remember back in the earlier flights, you see just this brutal shredding that's happening as it's re-entering the atmosphere. And it seems to just be improving for every mission. So I'm excited to see kind of what it looks like this mission. But I think the real kind of test as to whether this is going to be a completed system would be when they can withstand multiple reentries. So.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be an interesting inflection point. Obviously, the space shuttle, had to go through quite a bit of downtime in between flights of the orbiters. So,
Yeah.
If SpaceX can do what it purportedly wants to do, which is a rapid reuse of a Starship, not just reuse the heat shield. Just want to know for folks real quick, if you notice, our clock is back in motion. We do have a new T0 for you. It is 6:51 p.m. Eastern. That is 5:51 p.m. Central, 22:51 UTC. So just a slight adjustment, about 6 minutes into the full 90-minute window that SpaceX has available to it. So still plenty of wiggle room if SpaceX needs to continue bumping down further and further into its time here. But the clock is back moving, and again, 5:51 Central, 6:51 Eastern, 22:51 UTC is the new current T0 for this flight. Kind of picking up towards the future ambitions for Starship. Next year we are going to see a version of essentially what is over at the pad right now, a Flight 3 or version 3 iteration of Starship, dock with the Orion spacecraft. So not quite as dynamic as what Blue Origin's going to be launching and docking with Orion and a demonstration of their habitable module. Joey, you and I had a chance to really, sit and parse through the changes to the Artemis 3 mission and what it looks like now versus what it looked like, back years ago. How are you feeling about all the announcements and all the changes and updates that have been made to this next test flight in the Artemis campaign, and how Starship, brings what its hardware is going to look like to the party, if you will?
Well, as a journalist, I'm feeling stressed because there's just so much work to do. There's so much to analyze and so much to cover these days. But how the Artemis 3 flight is shaping up, it's so interesting because it's going to require all these elements to come together almost at the same exact time. Of course, as we know, Starship and Blue Moon are vastly different vehicles. So the idea that they have to be ready at the same time within a matter of a few weeks, I think, is going to be very, very difficult. And if they are to have humans on board, which there will be, there's 4 astronauts already named to this mission, that means that not only are these vehicles going to have to be able to maneuver in space and withstand the conditions of docking and maintaining their orbits and attitudes, but they have to have a Euclid system as well. I don't know if I can't remember if there were requirements for the astronauts to go in each moon lander. I think that's kind of a high goal that they would want to do. But there's just so much work that needs to be done before we get to that point. And remember, I think it's still 2027, late 2027 that they're targeting for Artemis 3. And so there's just a lot of stuff that has to be done. And I'm we haven't seen much on the astronaut quarters and what the little habitat inside Starship or Blue Moon is going to look like, of course. So I just kind of wonder when we're going to start seeing that. Is NASA going to start releasing things like that? Is SpaceX going to be talking about that? And at what point? Because the clock is ticking. So, yeah, we'll see. I don't know.
Yeah, just to that point, I imagine you've had a number of conversations, as we have with the Human Landing System Office. And, it seems that a number of times, if you try to go to some of those specifics, it's hard for them to give them to us from where they're sitting because they're walking a line of being able to answer our questions as well as recognizing that to a large extent this is intellectual property of both SpaceX and Blue Origin, and so there are some things I think that they feel like they can disclose and some that they can't, and so it's sort of a squishy in-between place of us wanting to help our readers and viewers understand as much as possible about what these will do, how they'll function, timelines and capabilities and things like that. And it's, as Joey, hard to get answers on the record from the companies themselves, and then if NASA is also constrained from what it feels like it can say, that makes it difficult for us to really inform our viewers and readers of what exactly these astronauts are going to be going into, both literally and figuratively.
Right. Yeah, that's a challenge we as reporters face quite often. And when NASA refuses to say something about one of its contractors, landers, as you said, right, it's kind of under the guise of commercial confidentiality, which I think is interesting because although there is this burgeoning lunar economy and there's a few different players involved in it, obviously Blue Moon and Starship, although they're under fixed price contracts, the main customer is NASA, and they've put billions of dollars into this so far. So I think the public deserves a little bit more insight than what NASA is currently giving into the status of these landers, just given their importance to U.S. power and the amount of money that underlies these contracts. So yeah, it's interesting. And of course, SpaceX, likes to kind of tell its own story. They don't respond to almost any of the requests that, the press sends about these things. So yeah, it's an interesting program to cover.
Speaking of interesting moments in SpaceX, just taking a moment, looking at the clock here, we're about 1.5 minutes away from when we expect SpaceX to conduct the readiness poll for the start of fueling for this mission. So you look at the center of the tower, you see the big vent going on with the LOX line. This is what we'd expect to see prior to teams loading liquid oxygen on board the ship upper stage. So that's a good sign, suggesting that they may not need another shift in the T0, at least as things are currently standing right now. And the first bit of fueling will happen with the LOX tank, and that process starts at T-minus 37 minutes and 30 seconds if all continues to move on as expected. So things are continuing to march forward for the Starship Flight 13 launch attempt. For folks that are perhaps not as plugged into what this new Artemis 3 is going to look like, want to go to a little bit of tape that we were able to have from our conversation with the HLS program manager, Steve Creech, about what this newly architected Artemis 3 looks like and where it brings in the HLS landers. So let's go ahead and listen into that, and we'll come back on the other side.
All along, we had planned for each Blue Origin and SpaceX that they were going to do what we call an uncrewed demo, to go take their lander, land on the moon, demonstrate that landing piece. What Artemis 3 does for us is the other piece that we really want to test is the interaction with Orion and the crew systems. And so what this mission is going to do is allow Blue Origin will launch first, a test vehicle with actually a fully outfitted first version of their crew cabin, docking adapter. Then Orion will launch, they'll dock and test, be able to demonstrate that docking, demonstrate crossing the hatch, and then SpaceX will launch the Starship, and we'll also do a rendezvous and docking with Starship. So an exciting new mission, and it really fills a gap that we had in our previous plan. We had the uncrewed demo, and we had tested out SLS and Orion, but now we get that first test of them together. It's still a little bit in trade, but I would, if I had to guess, we're looking at both options, both Starbase in Texas and in the Cape. There are some benefits to the Cape. So I think you'll likely see Starship launch out of the Cape. And yes, so the last launch, you'll have a Blue launch with their test vehicle, then SLS and Orion off of 39B, and then likely Starship off of 39A.
So a good bit packed in there. Joey, it sounds like there's still some trade-off of, whether it makes more sense to launch out of Florida or out of Texas, where they've already got the infrastructure ready to go for Starship. To your mind, what would be the benefit of launching from Texas versus Florida, given that, bringing in Florida is something they're obviously going to have to at some point to really have a good understanding of how all these three massive rockets work together in tandem, both from a range safety perspective, but also from a resource sharing perspective when you've got, within the span of 2 weeks, New Glenn launching then an SLS and then a Starship rocket.
Yeah, that's a good point. New Glenn obviously launches out of Florida, and Starship launching out of Florida, it'd be kind of right next door. So there'd be a lot of activity going on in the Cape if they were both to fly out of Florida. When I think of, a Starship supporting an HLS mission, I think of the tanker flights that are going to have to launch kind of in a rapid succession to refuel the Starship that's in orbit. But for this particular mission, since it's in LEO, I don't know how that's going to work. I don't know if that's actually not a question I've asked, but I should look into that. And maybe it's out there, but it'll be interesting to see if that would be required, because if so, I think SpaceX, of course, has more experience launching Starship out of, they have the only experience launching Starship out of Texas. So if they do need to launch any kind of rapid succession of tanker flights, then it would maybe be best to do it out of Texas. But yeah, one of the interesting things I remember from the last Starship launch attempt live stream last week, Kate Tice, SpaceX engineer, had mentioned that they are potentially expecting to launch the first Starship out of Florida. I think she said by the year's end, so the end of this year, which is ambitious. I used to cover space down in Florida. Will, you're down there, obviously, and it's just crazy thinking of a Starship launching out of the Cape, especially from 39A. But I don't know if that's what they would intend to do for this particular mission. But yeah, I think a lot of stuff has to get in order before they do that. But I wouldn't put it past SpaceX. You never know.
Well, the good news from a logistics standpoint is that they don't have to do the prop transfer for Artemis 3, so they take that risk item off the table. So that,
Right. Okay.
I think,
Cool.
both that and the fact that they are not having the astronauts go inside of a Starship, so there's no eclipse system, I think also
Okay.
helps buy down a good bit of risk from the SpaceX side of things. So quite a bit less
True.
to deal with. But
Right.
I guess just given that, the fact that they aren't testing the eclipse system with this mission, that they are using essentially an off-the-line version of Starship like we're about to see launch, in the next 45 minutes and change. How much pressure do you think that puts in the on-the-ground testing and simulation, given that potentially the first time a crew docks with a habitable Starship, an HLS version, might be as they're getting ready to head out to the moon?
That puts a lot of pressure on SpaceX for sure. I don't quite remember the exact order of the missions, the test missions that SpaceX needs to do before it actually lands on the moon. But remember, they're going to be doing an uncrewed demo. That's still right? Like
That's still the plan, yeah.
right. So I mean, that would be, I would think, a pretty robust test of the Euclid system if they plan to have it on there. Obviously, you want to test like you fly, and it would make sense to test Euclid systems in space without a crew before you actually put humans on board. But again, it's just a lot to do before we have to make that timeline for 2028 to put humans on the moon. SpaceX has heritage and experience, of course, with Dragon, but Starship is just a totally different animal. So it's kind of hard to know.
I do want to be respectful of your time, Joey, and we just have a few more minutes with you, but I do see we've got a question in the chat that might be good for you to jump in on as well. One of our viewers asks, is it possible NASA takes more of a hands-on approach if they feel SpaceX or Blue Origin fall further behind with their schedules for HLS, end quote. And I think, to start with that, and then I'll let you jump in, we have seen NASA start to really lean more forward when it comes to their presence with both companies. I mean, you can look at just the announcement today where there's an agreement in place for Blue Origin to test the New Glenn upper stages, where they previously were doing that at Launch Complex 36. Now they've got access to a test stand out at the Stennis Space Center in Mississippi. And, through the HLS office, both SpaceX and Blue Origin have had engineers and experts from NASA, specifically the Marshall Space Flight Center, where they have a good bit of experience with cryogenic systems, embed with both teams to offer them help and, work through some of those challenges. But, Joey, what's kind of your read on, do you think from what we've heard from Administrator Jared Isaacman, if there may be even more of a hands-on, given the challenges that we've seen with SpaceX and Starship and Blue Origin, obviously the big setback with their rocket, but also, still have a little ways to go with Blue Moon Mark II?
I think definitely we will see NASA have more of a hands-on approach as the deadline gets closer and closer. And what I think is interesting also is, the various priorities that SpaceX has with Starship, right? They're a publicly traded company now on very, very ambitious goals to put AI satellites in space, which will be launched on Starship. And then, of course, the expansion of the Starlink constellation with V3 and other types of satellites. And that's a very, very important revenue-focused goal that SpaceX has that sometimes is at odds with the progress that it needs to make on the Moonlander program. And maybe last year, I think we heard on one of the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel calls, I think it was Paul Hill, who kind of seemed to suggest that, SpaceX has all these various priorities with Starship, and NASA needs to figure out how it can get the company even more focused on the moon program to achieve these objectives that it needs to make before landing humans on the moon. And after that, I mean, we saw obviously what Jared Isaacman has done with the Artemis program. Elon made his big pivot from Mars to the moon, so I think that was a pretty dramatic, step towards getting a little more serious about the HLS timeline and the Artemis program. But we're still a little far away from Artemis 3 and of course 4, relatively. And so I think the closer we get, we might see some more dramatic kind of announcements or efforts from NASA to kind of wrangle SpaceX even closer into the program, which will coincide with really important milestones in SpaceX's exclusive business too, right? Like Starlink and AI. I mean, it's all moving very, very quickly, and that's where SpaceX is really making a lot of money or wants to make a lot of money. And this moon program is very important from a national perspective and a geopolitical perspective, and it's kind of an iconic role that SpaceX has. So how they balance those two priorities, those many priorities, I think is going to be interesting, and it will probably require NASA to step in a little bit more and say, we need you to move a little bit faster here, or we need you to get this requirement done quicker, or something like that. So yeah, I think there's definitely going to be some more involvement or an effort to have more involvement by SpaceX in the program.
And lastly, before we let you go, obviously folks can find Joey's reporting over at Reuters. One of the more recent stories you've done, Joey, is obviously about this mission getting into Flight 13 with the second attempt. And in, I believe, your latest article, you reported on, some of the jitters from investors, for maybe people that aren't as familiar with the ebb and flow of space flight and the anomalies and challenges that happen with launching a test vehicle. Given that this is SpaceX's first launch of Starship, now that it's a publicly traded company, how do you feel like this mission really fits into the grander ecosystem of SpaceX's priorities now that it does have, this big, bucket of focus with the investors, in addition to the government side with the DoD and then NASA with the Artemis program?
Yeah. I think the reaction to the scrub last week, the stock market reaction was interesting. There was a lot of people saying that, investors don't understand space flight, and that might be true to some extent, but I think there is some room for actual, authentic activity reactions to a scrub like that, because this is, there's been 12 flights so far since 2023. The program is not exactly on the schedule that Elon initially set out for. In fact, it's maybe a few years behind schedule. So investors, I think, are more and more increasingly eager to see meaningful progress on these flights. We don't really know how many more flights are going to be before they actually achieve orbit and start deploying satellites routinely. But this test today is going to be very, very important kind of barometer in that. And yeah, Starship is going to be the workhorse that expands Starlink and puts into space these AI ambitions that Elon has. So and with the Starlink satellites that we'll see on board today, of course, that'll be an interesting test to see how those systems all kind of work together. So I think investors and the Pentagon and NASA are going to be looking very closely for progress and very eager to figure out what the next test is going to be, and then when SpaceX can start actually deploying satellites in orbit.
Joey Roulette, space reporter over at Reuters. Thanks again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
And again, that was Joey Roulette, space reporter over at Reuters. Appreciate him joining us. And right now, we are just at the point at which SpaceX should be starting the fuel loading of its Starship Super Heavy rocket. First up is ship LOX load getting underway. You see the vent is still underway there on the center of the tower. Well, as we are getting into the heart of the fueling timeline, let's go ahead and familiarize folks with what that looks like with this version of Starship Super Heavy rocket, since there have been changes from time to time with these test flights, so this is where things are situated right now. Things kicking off with the SpaceX launch director making a call on fuel load at around T-minus 50 minutes. We expect that. Well, we haven't had specific word from SpaceX. Oh, we do have confirmation that prop load has begun. That again starts with the first milestone you see there on your screen, T-minus 37 minutes 30 seconds. Ship locks load, and then liquid oxygen loading on the booster started about a minute ago now. Coming up next will be the loading of liquid methane on the Super Heavy booster, followed by ship fuel load just under a minute after that. As tanking continues, SpaceX will transition into the Raptor chill down at T-minus 21 minutes and 30 seconds. That's when they flow a small amount of liquid oxygen through the plumbing and turbo pumps on those Raptor engines, both the 33 sea level Raptors on the booster and the 3 sea level and 3 vacuum engines on the ship upper stage. Tanking rolls on until about T-minus 2 minutes and 50 seconds when it'll wrap up on the booster, followed by the upper stage about 40 seconds later. About 1 minute 40 seconds before the planned liftoff, you'll see what SpaceX may refer to casually as the wiggle test, that is the thrust vector control checkout, where you'll see the engines that can toggle their motion on the Super Heavy booster shift a little bit in position. Sometimes you'll see that as well on the ship upper stage. 30 seconds before flight, the SpaceX launch director will verify that they are go for launch if that is in fact the case. The flame deflector will be activated at T-minus 17 seconds. Raptor engine ignition sequence will kick on in the final 3 seconds before liftoff. And hopefully, if all of the kinks have been worked out at this point, we'll see a good liftoff of Flight 13 for the Starship program, T0. Again, that T0 time did shift during our conversation with Joey, currently looking at that departure time now at 5:51 p.m. Central, 6:51 p.m. Eastern, 22:51 UTC for those joining around the world. About 33 and a half minutes remaining on the clock right now. At this point, all 4 tanks on the Starship Super Heavy rocket should be in loading at this point in time. Time now, T-minus 31 minutes, 1 second, and counting. SpaceX progressing towards the planned liftoff of Starship Flight 13 with just half an hour remaining in the count, and SpaceX starting to show some pad-level views of the rocket here, as well as some aerial drone shots. We'll be listening for relevant updates from SpaceX, and if there's something that feels extremely relevant and important for us to bring into the broadcast, we'll bring that up as well. As we've been talking about with our guests, some of the big objectives for SpaceX in the Starship Flight 13 mission today will include the deployment of 20 Starlink V3 satellites, the first time that SpaceX has deployed actual production satellites, and the team will attempt to connect the satellites with the broader constellation. They will demise about 20 minutes after deployment from the ship upper stage, following the same suborbital trajectory as Ship 40. Just about 10 minutes from now, we should see SpaceX go through the engine chill on the Raptors across the vehicle. And we are just about 28.5 minutes from liftoff. We are getting an update now from SpaceX's Dan Hewitt. Let's go ahead and listen in.
Engine adapts in real time, but you saw 4 not light up. So 4 out of 33, what exactly happened? We have a launch constraint built in where we can only be down 2 Raptor engines at liftoff. So the vehicle detected more than that were out, automatically aborted before the final T0 safely shut down all of the engines that started up. We dug through the data, and what we saw was some off-nominal spin response in the aux turbo pumps on 6 of the engines. So the most likely root cause was determined we were collecting some moisture inside of the pumps from previous operations, which then froze when we introduced that cryogenic propellant, and that either slowed those pumps down or stopped them completely from spinning. So in 6 engines that were already at Starbase, and we did a test back on Wednesday that allowed us to check out the newly installed engines and spin the aux pumps on all 33 after they were chilled, check out their performance before we got into another launch attempt. We pulled a bunch of those engines off. As we said, we tested one on a test stand up at McGregor, helped screen for any other issues that might be hiding, and that one was actually able to do a full booster ascent burn. So got us in a good position for today. Even though we didn't get off the pad last week, we learned about the engines, the prop systems, how they perform in the flight environment. Already going to drive some changes to make Starship more reliable. We also got a real-world test of an abort that's designed to take place at one of the most critical dynamic phases of
Speaking of having critical issues at inopportune times, we're also experiencing a little bit of stutters with the SpaceX broadcast. We're working to resolve that in the background and get that fixed and back into the broadcast for you as soon as possible. In the meantime, you can start to see the frost line building up on the various tanks across the Starship Super Heavy vehicle. A little bit backlit from this perspective. If we can swing around to the other side where it's more sunlit, it's quite a bit more prominent, as SpaceX is just now about 25 minutes, 40 seconds and counting to liftoff of the rocket. And as you were hearing from SpaceX's Dan Hewitt, they did have an off-nominal spin response with some of the turbo pumps. Looks like we've got that back. Let's listen in again.
Completely obscuring your view through all of those critical phases of ascent. We're actually capable and legally allowed to launch into Lightning because we've done a ton of testing, unique testing, analysis, studying aircraft capabilities, and it's designed because that's ultimately the cadence we want to fly at, like an airplane. We're going to utilize that new capability carefully, but we're very aware if we want to fly Starship as often as you could fly an airplane, you're going to have to fly in weather that historically would keep rockets on the ground. So we're doing that analysis, we're doing that testing to prepare for the future. Aside from weather, we're watching the range, both in the Gulf right here off Starbase and in the Indian Ocean. That's currently green. And we are not tracking any vehicle or pad issues that will preclude a launch today. Speaking of the pad, that launch infrastructure, it's every bit as complicated as the rocket itself. It's designed to operate in some of the most extreme conditions on Earth. In case you missed it, we had some pretty cool insight into what it takes to launch the most powerful rocket on the planet in the second episode of our ongoing documentary, Starship.
Time currently T-minus 21 minutes, 44 seconds and counting. As SpaceX is getting into the engine chill, right now we are welcoming in our next special guest as part of our coverage of Starship Flight 13. Current space reporter over at Ars Technica, former editor here at Spaceflight Now, and frequent flyer of Starship broadcasts, Mr. Stephen Clark. Welcome back, my friend. How are you doing?
Doing great, Will. Happy to be back for another Starship launch.
Happy to have you back, and it's good to have some continuity across the broadcast, I think, since we've got a good parameter to compare previous experience to what we've got on deck. And obviously we saw a hard stop of the engines last go around. SpaceX feeling like they've got some of the hiccups ironed out, and we got a little update from Dan Hewitt as to some of the engine work that was needed to get them back to the pad. Based off what we heard, I know the audio got clipped there a little bit, but the fact that they were able to drop some engines, do the tests up at McGregor, get the rocket back to the pad in less than a week's time. What do you make of the downtime and getting back into a launch posture with that level of speed?
Yeah, well, I think it shows the benefits of having hardware-rich development. So they have numerous engines in various states of readiness and build and test in McGregor and at Starbase. So if I heard Dan correctly, Dan Hewitt from SpaceX said they were able to pull engines that were already at Starbase and plug them into the booster to replace the engines that had the issues during the launch attempt last week. They took one of the engines up to McGregor, did some tests on it. Of course, McGregor is testing my Texas geography, probably a 6 to 8 hour drive from Starbase. So getting it up to McGregor, doing tests on it, very, very quick turnaround, I think, for given they had issues with multiple engines. I think he said 6 engines showed all phenomenal spin response during the engine turbo pump startup sequence. And to have problems with so many engines and resolve it in a week or so is quite remarkable. And I guess if I heard him correctly, also the cause of the issue with all the engines is believed to be the same: some moisture in the pumps that got into the engines froze when they introduced the super cold propellant. So that caused the pumps to seize up during the engine sequence. And they've done some spin testing this week out at the pad, and I guess they have some confidence that the engines will light as designed during the countdown today, about 19 minutes away, or 18 and a half minutes.
Yeah, making good progress through the countdown, and one of the things that jumped out at me, and especially relevant vis-a-vis your reporting just today, Stephen, the fact that Dan mentioned, given all of the flight experience that SpaceX has, that they are comfortable and have safety capabilities to fly, even if there is lightning in proximity. I mean, given that we just saw Chinese, I believe it was the Long March 3B that was struck by lightning less than a minute into flight. Quite extraordinary that conceivably we could see something like that with a SpaceX rocket in the future.
Yep, that got my attention as well. I'm glad you brought that up. That was definitely a thread that I want to pull in the days ahead. And I think it's inevitable that rockets will have to launch in more unstable weather, so to speak, going forward to achieve the kinds of launch cadences that SpaceX and others want to be able to execute at. So launching in rainfall, launching in lightning, raising the wind constraint, all those types of things, I think, are ahead of us as more and more launches are occurring at various spaceports across the country. And I'll point out that the Space Force has had studies ongoing for years now, looking at how to relax the launch commit criteria for lightning and electric fields in the atmosphere at Cape Canaveral. You and I both have been out there at the Cape covering launches that have been scrubbed, particularly in the afternoons in Florida, evenings in Florida in summer. And it just is like Groundhog Day, sometimes over and over again, waiting for an opening in the storms. And to be able to fly rockets daily, you can't really be in a situation where the spaceport or the range is unavailable for many hours a day in certain seasons. And obviously lightning is not going to be an issue today. But I will note also that the Long March 3B rocket from China that we saw struck with lightning yesterday pushed through the Lightning and was able to achieve its mission. The other recent Lightning event with a rocket launch that I can think of is a Russian Soyuz launch back in 2019. It was struck by lightning 30 seconds or a minute or so after launch. It proceeded with its mission and was successful as well. That's not always the case, though. One of the reasons the lightning constraints have been so strict, particularly at Cape Canaveral, was an Atlas Centaur launch back in 1987 that was struck by lightning, and that triggered a catastrophic failure. So that definitely is still ingrained, I think, in the culture of the weather team and the range safety team down at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station.
Yeah, even when you have some rockets that make it through, as we just saw and you just mentioned, you always want to keep that in mind, especially if you're talking about future flights that would have humans on them. I imagine that while they may be able to reduce some of those constraints for uncrewed missions, that they will probably stay a little bit more stringent when it comes to launching humans into orbit and eventually missions back to the moon and someday onto Mars, that they may be a little bit more particular about lightning commit criteria in those situations.
I think so, and I think another weather criteria to watch out for with Starship is flight through precipitation. With Shuttle, even with Dragon, a vehicle that has a thermal protection system, heat shield exposed, there's a restriction to not launch during precipitation because the rain droplets or ice pellets in the upper atmosphere can cause damage to the sensitive heat shield. And SpaceX is looking to get the heat shield for Starship to be very robust to those types of damages and be able to be rapidly reused with no refurbishment. So if that is what SpaceX is able to accomplish with the heat shield, maybe rain's not an issue. But until then, I think the one weather rule to watch out for to see if it is relaxed or not is the flat through precipitation rule.
All very important points and things that I'm sure that they're having quite a bit of deep conversations about moving forward. Speaking of moving forward, just about 13 minutes, 40 seconds before hopefully this launch moves forward today and we see SpaceX tick some of those boxes that they were unable to accomplish with Flight 12. Stephen, as we're looking towards the mission objectives on the other side of liftoff today, one of the ones that we didn't see them accomplish last time that I think a lot of folks are wanting to make sure that they are able to accomplish with the version 3 iteration of the Raptor engines is that relight during the coast phase. To your mind, in the roster of important objectives for today's flight, testing the heat shield, the relight, deploying the Starlink V3 satellites, what's most, where does that fall in your hierarchy of important objectives that SpaceX really needs to make sure that they accomplish with this mission, or would be more of a detriment if they're not able to?
Well, I would hesitate to put any of those in a hierarchy because if any of them go wrong or go poorly on this mission, I think that puts the next launch, whether the next launch goes to orbit or not, in question. Because if they're not able to do the relight again, I think that likely means the next mission will be another suborbital flight. If the heat shield has sustained serious damage on launch or reentry, I think that would put a pause on an orbital flight as well. And deploying Starlinks, of course, they could go to orbit without deploying Starlinks, but I suspect on the first orbital launch they will deploy operational Starlink V3s. So they want to test those out as well on this flight. So for importance for Starship, I would rank the engine relight and the heat shield performance as the top priorities to look for. That I would be watching for the results from those tests. And secondary would be Starlink V3 deployment and whether the Starlink V3s are able to execute some of their activation sequence during that narrow window of time after they deploy before they re-enter the atmosphere today.
Definitely a lot to get through with this mission, and just about 11 minutes before we really get a good pull on where things stand with the hopeful liftoff here, just shy of 11 minutes from now. Taking a quick look at the, actually, let's go ahead and bring in this flight profile for the mission just to give folks an overview of what we're going to expect if there is a good liftoff. Following liftoff from Pad 2 at Starbase, the booster will reduce from 33 down to 5 engines. Ship will ignite its engines. Going to be a different startup sequence for the ship upper stage to prevent the off-nominal flip that we saw with the booster last time. Looking for a good splashdown in the Gulf this time around at the designated site, unlike last time. Ship will deploy 20 Starlink V3 satellites and perform that engine relight that we were just talking about. And then over in the Indian Ocean, they'll go through the reentry profile and then splash down in the waters of the Indian Ocean, where there are a series of buoys and other remote cameras ready and waiting for the arrival of the ship upper stage. Let's go ahead and listen in for a status update on the count.
For launch today. Range continues to be green. Our range team hard at work making sure we're clear out in the Gulf and in the Indian Ocean, where we're going to be sending the Starship. Weather continues to be gorgeous. Again, no clouds. We scrubbed our attempt yesterday, or didn't even try yesterday, because we had such poor visibility. Weren't going to be able to see those tiles on the way up. That's a key kind of experiment objective for this flight today. And so we're looking really good with weather today. In the future, we'll see what kind of adverse weather we can fly into. We are capable and allowed to launch into lightning, but we're going to utilize that new capability carefully as we eventually continue to evolve Starship to fly it at an airplane-like cadence. You can see the prop load there on your screen. We're just about closed out on the main tanks on the ship. We just started propellant load in the header tanks on Starship. Those are the two smaller ones up top that we'll hopefully be using for the in-space burn and a landing burn at the end of its mission. We started loading our propellant at about T-minus 35 minutes today, and we're going to continue all the way down until we're inside 3 minutes to launch. We'll close out at about T-minus 2 minutes and 50 seconds on booster, and then 2 minutes and 10 seconds on the ship. So at the moment, we're looking good. That launch time, 5:51 p.m. Central, a couple of minutes into our window today. So we'll be back real soon. Toss it back down to Kate and Nate.
Thanks, Dan. Recently, NASA announced the
Just under 7.5 minutes remaining in the count. As you saw and heard from Dan, teams are continuing to progress towards the planned liftoff, currently at 5:51 p.m. Central, 6:51 p.m. Eastern, 22:51 UTC. Got multiple views from around the Starbase area, from the west of the pad looking at it. Actually, let's go ahead and show you, mentioned this earlier in the broadcast. Here's the view of the International Space Station looking back down at Starbase prior to the launch today. From a former SpaceXer to the current SpaceX team, wishing them well with a launch attempt. International Space Station, of course, getting ready for some more change as the recent Soyuz crew that has been on orbit for about 8 months with NASA astronaut Chris Williams is about to depart, and a change of command ceremony scheduled for tomorrow. NASA astronaut Jessica Meir getting ready to take command of the station as those on orbit looking down at the upcoming launch of Starship, now less than 6 minutes away from flight. Weather continues to look good. Less than 3 minutes till the planned wrapped up of fueling. SpaceX reporting no issues being tracked at this time. But we do know that if they happen to run into any hiccups between now and liftoff, they can hold the count at the T-minus 60-second mark. And they can hold in that spot for the better part of 10 minutes and then reset the clock. Again, that is if there is an issue that crops up as we get into the final minute of the count. But right now, tracking no issues. 5 minutes remaining before the planned liftoff of Starship Flight 13. Again, for folks that may have missed it earlier in the broadcast, got about 30,000 of you are watching along with us now. First off, thanks for being with us here. Just inside of 3 minutes, at about T-minus 2 minutes and 50 seconds, is when the booster prop load will wrap up. Ship propellant load will wrap up about 40 seconds after that. The thrust vector control checkout, or the engine wiggle test as it's referred to sometimes by SpaceX, will happen in about T-minus 1 minute 40 seconds, where we will see a little bit of actuation from the middle ring engines on the Super Heavy booster. Booster prop load should be complete now. Nearing the end of ship propellant load in about 20 seconds. SpaceX says they've got a go ahead from the range, progressing into the final 2 minutes of the count. Prop load wrapping up. SpaceX reporting no holds at the moment. Less than 2 minutes remaining. Coming to the thrust vector control check, you can see the engine view there. There you can see just a little bit of motion. Coming into the final minute of the count. SpaceX launch director will make their call if they are go for launch in the final 30 seconds, waiting to see if they pass through the final 60-second hold point.
All right, we are through the gate. Still no holds on the board. 50 seconds to go. Starship getting ready to fly.
Coming up on the launch director's call next.
Flight directors go for launch.
And a good go for launch call from the flight director. 20 seconds. 15 seconds. And here we go. In 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Enter ignition. And liftoff. Liftoff of Starship Flight 13. Rocket has cleared the tower.
Seconds into flight, 33 out of 33 Raptor engines lit on the Super Heavy booster, arcing away from us here at Starbase.
And a minute, 22 seconds into flight. So far, looks like all 33 Raptor engines still lit. SpaceX approaching hot staging next. The reduction of the engines on the Super Heavy booster from 33 down to 5. The ignition of the Raptor engines on the ship upper stage. And a separation of the two. They will attempt the directional flip in the right direction this time, send the booster on its way towards a good boost back burn. 2 minutes into flight, less than 20 seconds to MECO. Super Heavy, most engines cut off. Good view of those engines there. Ship should be in hot staging now.
Tap.
6 ignite.
Backburn startup.
And the booster now doing its boost back burn. It looks like we lit all 33 initially. Now we're down to 13. We're seeing 6 out of 6 Raptors lit on the ship.
Backburn shutdown.
And boost back burn shut down. So it looks like we were able to get through the boost back burn this time around. That was one of the key objectives we didn't have on the last flight.
Nominal.
And we've got 6 engines lit on the ship. All right, so that's the first of 2 burns that the booster is going to be doing to kind of send it back towards us. It's going to be landing a couple of miles offshore from Starbase, hopefully. We're going to try and get it all the way down to do a landing burn, where we're going to use those 13 center engines. They're going to ignite. That's what's going to really bleed off all that velocity that it's built up. And it'll eventually hopefully transition to 5 engines to kind of fine-tune its path in, and then all the way down to 3 for the remaining bit. All right, we've got a couple of minutes to go until we get there. So booster's going to coast for a little bit. Ship still seeing 6 out of 6 Raptor engines lit. 4 minutes into the flight, ship's got about 4 minutes left. Getting some killer views. Kate, Nate, how was the view from from down there?
T plus 4 minutes, 23 seconds into the flight, as you've been hearing, all progressing well so far on Starship Flight 13. Attempt number 2 going well so far. The super heavy booster completing its boost back burn, making its way towards its targeted splashdown in the Gulf. Coming up on 5 minutes into the flight, the next major milestone ahead, Booster 20 will perform its landing burn beginning about 6 minutes 27 seconds into the mission. Good onboard camera views. You can see the shadow from the plume out stretching across the Gulf. The landing burn will last again from T plus 6 minutes 27 seconds, less than 30 seconds in duration, but expected to be able to conduct a controlled splashdown out in the Gulf here today. Good on little patina on the ship upper stage there. There are a myriad of camera views on board the ship upper stage. 6:16, just about 10 seconds to the start of the landing burn here for the super heavy booster. Still 6 good engines on the ship upper stage. Let's listen in for the start of this burn.
Call out for landing burn startup for the booster. I have a feeling the crowd's about to go wild here.
And another awesome landing for Super Heavy. Congratulations to all the teams here at Starbase and at our SpaceX team. An amazing, amazing view.
Everything continues to go well with ship, as you can see there on your screen.
Now T plus 7 minutes, 15 seconds into flight. We were just talking off mic that the booster engine configuration may have been a little bit of out of color from what they were expecting, and SpaceX's Dan Hewitt says that they were expecting the 13 engines to light up, and that didn't appear to happen exactly as they were hoping for, so a bit of a harder splashdown than what they were imagining. Ship is in terminal guidance now, approaching the end of its current burn. All 6 engines still ignited. Let's listen in for the call on ship engine shutdown.
And engine shutdown. All right, Starship 6 Raptor engines have successfully shut down.
Nominal orbit insertion.
And there's our call out for nominal orbit insertion. So we got a ship in space. We've got a booster in the Gulf where we were planning to send it. It's a hell of a start to the day, Kate.
Yeah, it sure is. All of our colleagues here are filing in through the doors. A lot of people wanted to stay outside and hear the boom. And so it's pretty great to see a ship in space, and everybody's super excited down here.
That's right. And as guaranteed, it has been an awesome day so far. All this action in just 9 minutes now. And objectives are done for the booster. Just want to quickly flag that that booster did land in a clear zone. We clear those before launch, well ahead, so that we ensure everyone is safe before the launch and after. So we're getting ready now for our in-space objectives.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes until the next milestone. So sit tight and enjoy this.
So with 9.5 minutes now elapsed so far in the mission, the next major milestone out ahead of SpaceX is the payload deployment, which should begin at about T plus 6 minutes and 40 seconds, lasting a little more than 11 minutes in duration. A live look now out back over the waters of the Gulf from our camera perspective from Adam Bernstein over on South Padre Island. So far, a relatively good mission for SpaceX. They got the boost back burn where they wanted it to, not the landing burn. Want to bring in Stephen Clark, reporter with Ars Technica, here as we are just hearing over the nets that the ship upper stage flight termination system has been safed now that it is in a good coasting trajectory along that suborbital path. Stephen, your thoughts so far on what we've seen and where ship is at the moment?
Yeah, well, certainly a notable improvement from the last flight. No engine failures on the way uphill on booster or ship, so that's a win. And it looked like the boost back burn went according to plan. That was really when things started to go wrong for the booster for Super Heavy back on Flight 12 in May. They got past that milestone. Not sure. We'll have to learn, in the days and weeks ahead, what happened with the landing burn. That clearly was not a nominal landing burn. They had a hard splashdown in the Gulf, just off the coast of Texas. But like it came down at a much slower, much more controlled manner than the last flight, which really seemed like it come down at close to terminal velocity. But not all the engines appeared to ignite for the landing burn. So that's something that I think they still need to work out for the next flight. And, it would not surprise me at all if the next flight they opt to do another water landing with the booster until they get that nailed down before they bring it back to Starbase and risk trying to land back at the pad. But ship is doing great from everything I've seen so far. It looks beautiful and great shots from space out over the Caribbean Sea right now.
So comparing Flight 12 to Flight 13, since those are the closest apples-to-apples comparisons we have with two version 3 iterations of the rocket, the last time when they got to this point, they ultimately made the determination that because they had one of the engines on ship go out during the coast phase, or as they were getting to the coast phase, that they ultimately decided to forego the in-space Raptor relight. Do you think that given the engines performed on ship seems like as expected, but not on the booster, that they'll still try to go for the Raptor relight, or do you think they might wave that off again this time around? I don't think we've heard anything on that just yet.
Yeah, we haven't heard anything yet. I don't see anything yet that would cause them to forego the relight at this point, because that's an important objective, and all the engines burned for the planned duration. They had a good insertion into their suborbital trajectory, cut off right on time, and everything, the way the ship is behaving right now, looks to be completely as expected. So unless something happens in the next few minutes or something goes terribly wrong with the Starlink deployment sequence, I think they're going to go for the relight attempt, and I think that's a big milestone for them.
Yeah, that'll definitely be good to see them get that completed.
But unfortunately, it looks like the Sorry. Well, it looks like we're going to be in orbital darkness again for the Starlink deployment, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think right now they're prioritizing getting daylight views of the heat shields at the splashdown site versus good orbital daylight views of Starship deployment. So hopefully the first time we see an orbital flight of Starship, there'll be a daylight deployment. Actually, we are just a little more than 14 minutes into the flight right now. The payload deployment start is coming up now in less than 3 minutes time. So coming up next, we will see the so-called PEZ dispenser door open, and hopefully we'll get some views inside Ship 40 as well. Get a nice angle of those Starlink V3 satellites. Just about 15 minutes into flight. Keep your eyes just above that S40 decal. That's where the door is. We should see that metal slat open up. Looks like the door is open now. SpaceX's Kate Tice noting that because there are not the same type of cameras on board the Starlink version 3 satellites, we unfortunately won't be getting the same type of camera views looking back at Starship that we did during the deployment of the final 2 last time around. A little bit surprised at that, since in the description of this launch, SpaceX does say, quote, 6 of the satellites have been modified with a suite of cameras to scan Starship's heat shield and transmit imagery down to operators to continue testing methods of analyzing Starship's heat shield readiness for return to the launch site for future missions, end quote. So just reading that, it sounds like the types of cameras that are on board will be good to get imagery down to SpaceX for analysis, but not necessarily the type of quick turnaround imagery that they would necessarily be able to broadcast in the midst of this live stream. So for those hoping to see the dramatic third-person perspective of Starship this time around, might be disappointed for that. But you do get these onboard views within Starship, and you see the first of the V3s getting poised for deployment, and there it goes. The very first deployment of a Starlink version 3 satellite. Now again, these are following a suborbital trajectory. So they are not going into orbit with the rest of the Starlink constellation, but SpaceX has said that their goal is to extend the solar panels on these satellites and attempt to connect to the rest of the constellation before their demise about 20 minutes from now. Seeing the next V3 go off into the suborbital void. coming up on 19 minutes into the flight. This deployment sequence is set to last until just about T plus 27 minutes 39 seconds or so. Let's go ahead and listen in to this update from Dan Hewitt.
Heat shield imaging that we attempted last flight. We don't have that camera view that we got on Flight 12 where you kind of see the satellite leaving Starship. Those aren't on the V3 satellites, but we are going to, on the last couple that go out, have some pretty narrow field view cameras that are going to be looking back at Starship, turn on some flashlights. And this is a test of a capability that we're really going to want when we start doing orbital flights, to just add that extra layer of safety, that extra layer of reliability, where we're going to be able to image Starship's heat shield after it's gone through ascent, after it's been in space, before it re-enters. So we're going to try to test that again today. The heat shield imaging, we didn't get a whole lot last time. Ooh, looks like we got some thunderstorms on planet Earth below us. But a couple more satellites to go, it looks like.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome to see our V3s in space. I want to give a shout out to our Starlink colleagues. Now we expect payload deploy to run until about 27.5 minutes, so about another 7 minutes here. The Starlink team will be attempting to speed run these tests, or excuse me, speed run test these version 3 satellites, where they will attempt to do a few tests such as extend the new solar arrays and antennas. They're also going to try and connect these V3 satellites with ground stations and turn on the satellite's communication systems. Now, they're only going to have about 20 minutes or so to do all of this, as these satellites only have that long before they demise in the atmosphere or break up due to that friction when they re-enter the atmosphere. So what we learn from today's deployment will help progress and move the program forward, which is super exciting. You could basically say that the payload's payload is data.
That's right.
We're getting very Inception here. Now, in addition to those tests for Starlink, for the Starlink team, as Dan mentioned, 6 of the satellites have been modified with engineering cameras to help scan Starship's heat shield. That will help inform our analysis of Starship's readiness for future catch returns back here at our launch site. So for those that might be unfamiliar, we are currently capable of catching our super heavy booster, and we've done that a couple times. We have not yet attempted to catch our second stage or ship, and so that is going to be a very exciting milestone when that day comes.
For sure, and we're building up to it with today's tests. We are still planning to do our water splashdown in the Indian Ocean, so stay tuned for that. That's only about 40 minutes away. But still, in space, we keep on deploying our Starlink satellites. Again, these are our V3 version of our Starlink satellites, a whole host of added capabilities to our version 2 that's currently in orbit.
And this is our team here at Starbase, Texas.
These are all of the team members that have helped build the vehicle, that have built the Pez dispenser, and got it ready to fly today. Amazing work.
Now, for those of you that have just recently tuned in, there is a spaceship in your screen, we promise. Right now, the ship is in orbital darkness, so we don't have any available sunlight from the sun to help illuminate the scene. But what you can see moving out from that smally lit space, those are the V3 satellites as they are being deployed. And essentially, the ship is illuminated from the inside, and so we're able to see the light come out through the payload door.
Right. Just a really small sliver of light at the top. That's our PEZ dispenser. That's how we're both loading our satellites into the rocket and deploying it. It's pretty novel. We've got about 3.5 minutes still left of our payload deploy sequence.
Yep, looks like we've got 16 satellites deployed, so 4 more to go. These last couple will have those cameras, so if you see any sudden bright lights, that'll be flashlights turning on those satellites to try and get some imagery of Starship's heat shield. 17 out the door, 3 more to go, and 18. All right, and while we wait for these last 2, we did confirm we are still go for our Raptor relight demonstration a little bit later in the flight today, so we will be looking to relight one of those Raptor engines on ship. And that'll be our next major milestone after we get through these final 2 satellites.
Just at 25 minutes into our flight, it's crazy to think that we're already screaming at 27,000 kilometers an hour, 200 kilometers above the ocean surface. Amazing.
Yeah. Now, for those of you that lost count, we have deployed almost all of our 20 Starlink satellites. I believe our last count was at 18, so we should be seeing 2 more. And we're very excited to see our version 3 satellites in space. And these are fully, these are real satellites. Right. They're not just demonstration sats like we had last time. These are going to basically have a 20-minute lifespan where our Starlink engineering team will attempt to perform a number of tests and really speed run those tests during that time.
Right. And in terms of satellite lifespans, 20 minutes is it's the shortest you could possibly get, but hopefully in that 20-minute time frame we can really try and ink out as many tests as we can.
It looks like we might have some, this might actually be light from one of the Starlink satellites. As we mentioned before, a few of them, 6 of them actually are equipped with flashlights to look back at Starship as we want to image the heat shield and understand the heat shield performance through the ascent phase, as this information is very important for us to know and understand as we prepare for operations that will enable ship to come back to Starbase for landing, for catch, I should say.
Right. And we are about 40 seconds away from that planned payload deployment sequence being complete.
Yep, looks like we've just got those last 2 to go. These ones might be coming out. Oops, they're starting to see motion. $19 out the door, 1 more.
It looks like we got a crowd at our Hawthorne, California location. Some colleagues gathering outside of Mission Control there as well.
And that marks, if I'm not mistaken, our 20th. So our payload deploy sequence is now complete. Starship will now close its payload bay door and continue to coast around Earth to the Indian Ocean. Still a lot of major events to come today, including our Raptor relight burn at T plus 38 minutes, 58 seconds, followed by atmospheric re-entry, where the heat shield will be put to test, and eventually our splashdown. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and go.
And some nice artificial light from the Starlink version 3 satellites as they drift away from ship. You can see the Pez dispenser door has closed. As you've been listening to the SpaceX commentators, there are cameras on board the Starlink V3 satellites, and it actually looks like you might be able to see one of them just drifting into the frame in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. You see that array of dots of light sort of drifting there. SpaceX on the nets calling out the completion of TVC checkouts, thrust vector control checkouts, presumably on the ship engine before the relight's set to take place, coming up in about 10 or so minutes. Seeing some actuation with the forward flaps on Ship 40. Still got quite a bit of illumination from the Starlink satellites. You can see another one of those still drifting into view from the perspective of the ship upper stage. Again, the goal with the Starlink V3 satellites was to extend their solar panels and try to connect to the broader Starlink constellation. And as Kate Tice mentioned, they are going to be working quickly since they've got just about 20 minutes or a little bit less before the satellite's demise. Unlike the ship, of course, they are not equipped with the same type of protective heat shield, and so they're very intentionally designed to not make it back through the atmosphere. I want to bring in our friend and colleague over at Ars Technica, Stephen Clark, who's been watching the progress of this mission so far along with us and is seeing now the views of Starship and the successful deployment of those V3s. Stephen, your thoughts on the first deployment of Starlink version 3 operational satellites and the mission at this point, this most recent milestone? Got the go-ahead as well for the engine relight, which is good news.
Yeah, well, everything is proceeding really well. The deployment sequence looked really clean, looked very similar to the last one. So the Pez dispenser mechanism, I think, is well demonstrated at this point. They've tested it on several flights now, so that's a good sign for SpaceX. And interested to hear if they were able to get any images from Starlink from any of the satellites as they deployed. They mentioned a couple of them had cameras to inspect the heat shield. I really thought it was interesting. We heard Dan Hewitt from SpaceX talk about when they go to an orbital flight, they want to be able to inspect and image the heat shield in orbit before they re-enter, after launch and before re-entry. And that really reminds me of the latter days of the shuttle program, where they developed, the boom to put on the end of the robotic arm to inspect the aisles underneath the shuttle in flight, and taking a lesson learned from NASA's experience with the shuttle. Of course, SpaceX wants their heat shield to be a lot more robust, easier to handle, more reliable than the shuttle heat shield, which was, carefully inspected, refurbished. Tiles were replaced between flights as needed. SpaceX doesn't want to be doing any of that. They want to be able to land or catch the ship and relaunch it same day, and so without even much inspection. So but it does use the similar ceramic tiles that are sensitive to impact and sensitive to things like micrometeoroid and orbital debris potentially in a long duration orbital flight. So really cool to hear that they're going to make an effort to inspect the heat shield before they commit to reentry on an orbital flight. Really spectacular views here of the Starlink satellites. Really cool. Looks like some UAP phenomena, but of course we know what those are.
Yeah, and you were just talking about it flying in front of the heat shield tile side of ship, and it looks like one of those Starlink satellites is doing just that. So, the benefit of having not just hunks of steel that sort of listlessly float away from ship, but actually to have their own bit of maneuverability, I think is going to be a really important asset on this mission. And hopefully we hear sooner rather than later following this flight, what the results of this imaging process is like for these V3 satellites, and how well they're able to integrate into the broader constellation too. I imagine the Starlink team is going to be very eager to see how the first V3 satellites play with the rest of the constellation.
Yeah, indeed, and hopefully we see some imagery from SpaceX on social media or something in the hours or days ahead. See what these satellites are capturing. It's really cool from this perspective.
Yeah, first outside words coming from the NASA administrator wishing SpaceX or congratulating them on the flight underway so far, saying, quote, "When Starship comes online, its capabilities will be game-changing, not least of which will be ensuring that we never give up the moon again," end quote. Obviously, the folks at the Human Landing System office very closely watching this mission since version 3 iteration of Starship, not too dissimilar from what we're seeing right now. We'll be docking with Orion potentially come this time next year, which will be quite something to see this rocket lift off from whether it's Florida or over there in Texas and make its way up into orbit to await the approaching Orion spacecraft. One thing that we were just thinking about as we were watching the ship during the deployment sequence, and just for folks that are wondering where we are in the timeline before I go into my next train of thought, we're just about 36 minutes into this mission, and the next milestone is coming up with the Raptor in-space relight demo in just about 3 minutes time from now. So want to make sure we don't step on that demo. But Stephen, obviously the Starlink constellation is going to be really important for SpaceX from a business perspective. But, as we've talked before, a lot of folks are going to want to fly their payload on Starship at some point down the road. And, folks over at Bloomberg reporting that SpaceX reportedly not taking any more customer orders from the commercial side of things beyond 2028. How do you think the broader spaceflight community is kind of looking at Starship at this point, given that we haven't heard a whole heck of a lot about deployment of payloads that are not flat pack type satellites like Starlink?
Yeah, we've seen some movement in the satellite manufacturing industry of late. Several companies coming out with flat sat designs that are modeled on Starlink version 3, similar dimensions that can use the same PEZ dispenser on Starship that we've seen demonstrated today. And so a few of these companies have come out with satellites to utilize that for different purposes. Starlink is broadband communications, but you could potentially do a Earth remote sensing mission. You could do a military type missions as well with this flat sat form factor. So I suspect we'll see those fly on Starship probably before we see a more traditional boxy type payload on Starship. But not every satellite can use that flat panel design. I'm thinking of things with big telescopes, missions that require large aperture antennas. Other types of spacecraft need different designs, need different architectures. So the people I've talked to in the industry are all pretty confident that SpaceX will eventually come out with a more conventional deployment system for other types of payloads. They're not sharing that information right now with the public, and from what I can tell, they're not sharing any details like that with their colleagues in the industry either.
Yeah, lots of folks that are going to be eager to get those designs so they can really start to make firm plans with upcoming flights of Starship. Just a quick note on the Starlink satellites that were just deployed. SpaceX noting that they were able to deploy the solar arrays and make the laser link connections with some of the other Starlink satellites currently up in orbit. So that's some good news from the Starlink team and their quick performance there. The burn is about to begin. Let's listen in.
Done about 3 seconds previously. And so that should be coming up within the next couple of seconds. Let's stand by.
Relight demo startup.
You see Relight there on your screen.
Wow.
And confirmation over the net. Relight shutdown. The burn has ended. Congrats to the team on this milestone. I mean, it's crazy to see how we can maneuver in space, and just another icing on the cake for today's mission. So we're going to be taking another quick break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes before.
And while we didn't see inside the engine compartment of Ship 40, did get on-screen telemetry data and confirmation from SpaceX of a good Raptor relight, which was a big box left open from Flight 12, now checked with Flight 13. So another major milestone underway and completed for SpaceX as they continue on with Ship 40. Now 40 plus minutes into the flight. The entry profile will begin in roughly 7 minutes time. But Stephen, we really focused on this last time during Flight 12, that not being able to complete that in-space relight demonstration was certainly an indication that this mission was definitely not, or more than likely not, going to be an orbital flight, which of course it was not. How big of a deal was it that they were able to get V3 relit in space for the first time?
Huge. I think that's a massive accomplishment to be able to get that behind them. They've done it, I think, once or twice with V2, if I recall. Very short burns, like 3 seconds. This was about 14 seconds in duration, and we saw the velocity on the lower left go up. So we saw some acceleration from the burn of the single Raptor engine, and some really cool light effects in the camera as well. Wasn't really sure what to expect to see, to be honest, but looked really neat, and we saw the velocity change as expected. So I think this is an accomplishment, a demonstration that shows that future ships in orbit will be able to deorbit themselves, and that takes away one of the safety concerns of putting Starship in orbit and worrying about it being stranded and unable to deorbit in a controlled manner, having it come down over land or a city, God forbid, uncontrolled. It could be a safety risk to the public, but this shows that they can maneuver and change the orbit of Starship in space, and this was the most significant in-space maneuver that Starship has conducted to date.
Yeah, and we heard from SpaceX President Gwen Shotwell saying that if they were able to get this milestone that we just saw done, that potentially we could see an orbital flight with Flight 14. Dangerous to make predictions when it comes to SpaceX, but for however much stock you want to put in your answer to this next question, do you think an orbital flight on Flight 14 is a realistic possibility, or do you think we've got at least one more suborbital mission out ahead of the company?
I like your phrasing. Realistic possibility, yes. Will they do it? I don't know. But realistic possibility after this relight, I can say yes. And of course, it depends on the rest of the flight. They've got to get the ship down to a controlled splashdown. They've been able to do that pretty reliably in the last few flights, but still some significant challenges to go here.
So definitely maybe. I like it.
Yes, exactly.
Well, we are just now 43 and a half minutes into the flight so far. About another 4 minutes to go before the entry profile really gets started. But as you can see with the telemetry data and the positioning graphic there on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you can see the orientation of ship getting into that correct entry angle of attack as it makes its way back through the atmosphere. Looks like maybe some thunderstorms down below. Looks like a little pop of lightning, if not mistaken, there for just a second. Obviously well below the ship and not in an area that would, threaten this flight right now. But on the comms, they noted that they are starting entry and ship is at a good attitude. Starting to see a little bit of plasma buildup, almost with some aurora-like colors with the green and purple. View inside the ship engine section here. And SpaceX noting on social media that they did successfully make contact with all 20 V3 satellites. So a good update confirming that the first deployment of Starlink V3 satellites, they were able to make contact with all 20 of them. Certainly bodes well for the future of the constellation as they are looking to launch satellites into orbit in the future. A little bit of a video freeze here. We're working to see if we can smooth that out. Stand by. We will bring this back in as soon as possible. And we've got that back for you now.
They are now below the Kármán line, so 94 kilometers and descending.
And it looks like done so in a controlled manner, so things continuing to progress well. Now 46 minutes and change into the flight so far. The landing burn as Ship 40 approaches the Indian Ocean will kick on at about T plus 1 hour, 5 minutes, and 3 seconds. They will perform the landing flip and then orient into that vertical position, then reduce their engines from 3 down to 2, and then 2 down to 1. And at that point, there should be quite a few camera angles on the ship upper stage, assuming that SpaceX, like with previous flights, is on course for that pinpoint re-entry that we've seen them perform multiple times now. The motion you're seeing on the camera view on the right is from one of the cameras that is on the tip of one of the forward flaps, and then I'll look back at one of the aft flaps on the left-hand side of your screen. As SpaceX is coming up to some milestones for entry, let's go ahead and listen in for those.
Specific points, we're doing pretty well.
That's right. So we'll continue to hear multiple callouts as we go through this phase. One of those callouts will be that the ship is transonic. We'll also hear another one when it's subsonic. Transonic will be referring to the period of flight where velocities of airflow surrounding and flowing past the vehicle are concurrently below, at, and above the speed of sound, so somewhere in the range of Mach 0.8 to 1.2. For reference, commercial jets have a range of cruising speeds, but most fly at roughly Mach 0.74, 0.85. Just for reference, that's between 480 miles per hour to 575 miles per hour, or 770 to 930 kilometers an hour. And subsonic, another call out that you'll hear later on in the stream. Subsonic will refer to speeds that are much less than the speed of sound. So at this point in flight, the ship's velocity will be slowing down drastically. So with reentry well underway, we'll take another break and return just before the ship's landing burn, targeted for T plus 1 hour and 5 minutes.
.5 minutes into flight, seeing some very dynamic visuals here as the ship continues to make it through the re-entry profile. Just about 50 minutes post liftoff, seeing slightly different coloration there for just a second from that one flat profile. And there you see it again there. Stephen, you and I have watched a number of ship entries, and you more than I when it comes to some of the footage during the shuttle program. This more dynamic, almost, and I hate to incorrectly characterize it, but just the light blue parts of the plasma that are streaking across, that looks different than what we've seen with previous ship entries. How would you characterize it?
Good question. Well, I agree that it's different, but no idea what is causing that. I'm not a thermal engineer or heat shield engineer, but we do know that SpaceX was planning to test Starship at higher dynamic pressures on this flight. So that may be what we're seeing here at this point in reentry, but I don't know for sure.
Maybe some additional venting that's combining with the more aggressive entry profile that just creates a different lighting dynamic of the plasma. I mean, so far we haven't heard anything from the team that makes it sound like they're concerned with this at all. So, don't want to be hyperbolic when it comes to our commentary. We'll watch as it comes. Just wanted to note the difference there from what we've seen previously.
Yep, and they're also nearing sunrise. So, we just saw that light go away. Interestingly, so they're nearing sunrise. So the sun angle may be a factor, but that's speculation.
So, certainly a fair speculation, I would say.
But the attitude looks pretty stable based on the display on the lower right. Nose up, high angle of attack, no sudden movements or anything, so it looks pretty stable.
Yeah, not seeing any aggressive changes in the numbers there on the bottom left either. So that seems to all be in. One thing to note from the performance that we've seen so far, Michael Nichols over at the Starlink side of the house for SpaceX, adding to the Starlink conversation. A little bit more of that plasma color change. Saying that, quote, we've successfully communicated with all satellites using RF and laser links and have been able to download key telemetry from the 20 Starlink V3 satellites. So some more confirmation of good data that has come down from the Starlink constellation. Just about 10 minutes away from the start of the landing burn here for Ship 40. A little more than 64 kilometers in altitude and descending. A little bit small, but in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can see with the telemetry data the position of Ship 40, currently out over the Indian Ocean as we speak, just approaching the western side of Australia, a little bit to the northwest of that continent. See the plasma streaking around one of those ship catch points there, just beneath the forward flaps. This will be good data for SpaceX to get back, obviously, when they want to catch the ship on future orbital launches. They want to make sure that there is good integrity on the ship catch points. Starting to get more into the daylight here and a little bit more definition from the clouds beneath Ship 40 as it makes its way towards the splashdown site. Really coming into view now. "57 minutes into flight, less than 10 minutes to the start of the landing burn. Some more actuation from the rear flaps.
You can really see the deceleration. Those numbers on the lower left ticking down quickly now.
Yeah, definitely starting to pick up nicely as ship cruises on towards the sunrise. Ship should be transonic in about 4 minutes' time. Now approaching nearly 1 hour from the initial liftoff of Starship Flight 13. Getting close to the end of this test flight with a number of the big milestones completed by SpaceX. A good relight of the Raptor during the coast phase, deployment of 20 Starlink version 3 satellites. Some more data learned about the Super Heavy booster, now completing the landing burn that they had hoped. SpaceX noting that ship is leaving peak heating. Temperature reduction underway. From this vantage point, the heat shield looks pretty good. We'll, of course, hopefully get some nice views from the landing zone buoys. And that'll give us a really good sense of where things stand. Ship now at maximum entry dynamic pressure. A little more than an hour into the flight. Rapidly approaching transonic speeds, and then ship will slip beneath subsonic speeds, traveling below the speed of sound here in just the next few minutes. As you can see with the graphic behind our clock, the views from ship that we've been seeing are made possible because of the Starlink satellite constellation currently on orbit. Worth noting that SpaceX did get the contract from NASA to provide Starlink laser terminals that will be fixed to the Orion spacecraft to provide 4K views during the Artemis 3 mission next year. So we will be getting views of similar clarity externally from the Orion spacecraft, which should hopefully give some really nice views during the approach and docking portions of the flight when the Orion spacecraft makes its approaches to both the Blue Moon Mark II Alpha vehicle as well as future Starship version 3 rocket. Just about an hour, 3 minutes into flight. Ship now below 1,000 kilometers per hour. landing burn coming up in the next about a minute and a half. As we're coming into these final milestones, let's go ahead and listen in as ship makes its final entry towards the landing burn, the flip, and then the reduction from 3 down to 2, down to 1. Let's listen in.
We've got our buoys and drones in range with the recovery team. They're going to be standing by to try and get some additional views of Starship's heat shield, which from kind of our initial looks, it did pretty well on the flight uphill, but we'll continue to dig through all the visual data as we get it. We didn't do any real stress tests or anything on this flight. We did do, you heard our landing Large flight controller call out. We were doing the swoosh maneuver. This is kind of the final maneuver that we plan to have starships returning to Starbase do. That will essentially hook them out over the Gulf before coming in and over Tower 2. But about 10 seconds away, look for 3 Raptors, the 3 in the middle, to light up, do a flip. Let's see if we can get this thing in the water. 3 sea level flip. Seeing healthy chamber pressures on. Did our flip down to 2. Starship descending into the Indian Ocean, down to 1. And we're in the water. And it's a soft splashdown in the water. That is a first. That is the softest splashdown we have ever had with the Starship there in the Indian Ocean.
It's bound to be an exciting day for our recovery team. I mean, that huge milestone to even get to soft splashdown, much less have the vehicle stay afloat.
Yeah, the teams are super hyped here. Got some crowd here at Starbase Texas. Everyone's super excited. We never really get to see Starship floating so serenely in the Indian Ocean, so we're certainly enjoying these extended views. Like I said, we're really pumped about this. I want to check in with Tyler. Tyler, how is Hawthorne feeling about Lucky Flight 13?
Hey, Kate, we are so excited about another successful Starship test flight and those gorgeous Starlink views that we had. And we can also confirm that we managed to make contact with all 20 of those V3 sats. So it's
and some sustained views of the Ship 40. Another good view of Ship 40. A really nice drone view of the heat shield. This is the first time that Starship upper stage has splashed down where it's remained in that much intact, where it has not exploded, and they can really just take their time and really take a good hard look at the ship heat shield. Views coming in and out from the SpaceX broadcast, but a really nice extended view of that, although it looks like there we go, back to the views there. Stephen, as we've got some additional views of the ship heat shield, your thoughts, and actually onboard cameras still streaming via Starlink.
Really, really amazing. We'll still have a good telemetry connection with the ship in the water intact. Getting all the up-close imagery of the heat shield is going to be a big haul for the heat shield team at SpaceX. So I think for the ship, from the ship's perspective, this was probably the most successful flight of the ship to date. Obviously, the booster did not have a controlled splashdown, but the ship performed marvelously, and I suspect there's a good chance of an orbital flight with the next mission. We'll see.
Yeah, the fact that not only is the ship remaining as intact as it currently is, but the fact that they are still able to beam back fuse from the ship in the water for as long as they have. Certainly the teams involved with ship engineering have to be ecstatic about many of the system performances of ship. Obviously, they'll study quite a bit from, and look at the engine shot there. That is something. My goodness. Just to that last point of yours, Stephen, given how well ship has performed, but the question's still outstanding regarding the Super Heavy booster, does make it seem like that there may be a possibility for an orbital flight with the Flight 14 mission, if that comes next month or perhaps in September.
I think a good chance. I wouldn't be surprised if they attempt to do another splashdown with the booster before they bring it back to Starbase on a subsequent flight. But Starship performed really well today, and this
looks like there are some tiles that are. Can't tell if those are just discolored or if those are missing tiles.
I'm looking at that too. Like, I don't know if those were dinged or damaged, or potentially the tiles that were intentionally left off. I don't know. But I will note that the ship is not rust colored. We saw that last year. It came down intact on target, but the heat shield was all orange from some oxidation, and it was a largely successful flight. But that was one big takeaway: is they need to make some changes to the heat shield because it is not in good shape. Don't see that today.
So normally the plan with a ship is just to, sink it since there's not much that's salvageable. But given that there's a very buoyant ship right now that seems to be, pretty well surviving, do you think that there's even an outside possibility that they might be able to tow this thing to shore and actually get their first recovered Starship?
I think they're going to try. They're going to think about it. They're not going to blow it up in the next 15 minutes, I suspect. I think they'll think about it. We'll see if they can do it.
I mean, it definitely presents maybe this was in an outside thought for them that they might be able to do this at some point, but the recovery team has to be, plotting and scheming at this point. I imagine just thinking of, what could we marshal fast enough to hook safely to ship and bring it to shore? I mean, that would be great data for the engineers to be able to actually get some chunk, if not a large bit of Starship, whether it's studied down there in Australia or somehow managed to be barged over to Starbase or maybe to Florida, possibly sending some of those heat shield tiles back to the bakery and, getting a closer inspection on those. It just seems too good of an opportunity to pass up.
Yeah, it really does. I'm not sure how they can do it. Towing it, I think would risk it breaking apart in rough seas. If you have to bring in some heavy equipment, that's going to take time. So I am skeptical that they can do it initially, but I think they're thinking about it. As I said, I think it would be foolish not to think about it and see what they can do.
Absolutely. Well, as we've got both ship and Super Heavy booster down in their respective aquatic landing zones, that's just about going to do it for us here with Starship Flight 13. But before we wrap things up, we're going to go ahead and say goodbye to our friend Stephen Clark. Stephen's space reporter over at Ars Technica. Stephen, two-part question to you. Where beyond the website can folks find your writings and coverage of the space program, and what do you have your eye on with the next several days or week to come?
Yeah, you can find me at arstechnica.com. That's where you'll find space reporting from myself and my colleague Eric Berger at Ars Technica. My X handle is at Stephen Clark1. My name's with a PH. And as for what I'm looking forward to the next coming days or weeks, looking forward to actually a bit of a vacation. I'll say that first of all, but looking forward to writing more about Golden Dome. I think that's something that I've been really trying to focus on the last few months is the evolution of that program and what may happen to Golden Dome if there's a change in Congress this fall. And so that's something I'm really looking forward to digging into. As for August, looking forward to the launch of the Roman Space Telescope at the end of on Falcon Heavy. That's a big one. And yeah, innumerable other things as well. So lots of things on the horizon.
Well, we hope to see you down here in Florida for the Roman launch next month. That's going to be, I think, a quite spectacular one for all of us here. Obviously, seeing a Falcon Heavy is always a treat, and for the folks that have been working on the Roman telescope for quite some time, to see that head off towards Lagrange Point 2 is going to be quite spectacular for them as well, and the broader NASA science team. So, Stephen Clark with Ars Technica, thank you as always for joining us. Look forward to catching up again.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks, Will.
Thank you. Take care. And before we go ahead and wrap up our broadcast, of course, our Adam Bernstein was down there at Starbase to capture the launch. So let's go ahead and run it back and see what his view was like in full.
Can you see it? Magic. Can you see it?
As we continue to watch this video captured by our Adam Bernstein, want to thank a few folks in the live chat who've been very kindly supporting our coverage today. Want to thank Jimbo for a $20 super chat coming in before the launch, saying Lucky 13. Let's get this candle lit. CRS underscore with membership for 40 months now at the pad leader level, who says woohoo. Thanks for all the coverage, Spaceflight Now. And hat tip to the chat and the mods. Good hot staging views there from Adam's tracker camera. Marla Plunk with a $20 super chat as well. Thank you so much, Marla. Thanking us for the coverage. Welcome into new channel members Joe Darrow joining us at the pad leader level, and Mary K. Cat at the mission specialist level. Thanks to both of you. Thanks to Arenas Emmanuel for super chat there, and to Base NJI as well, $5 super chat. Thank you so much. Deborah Moore with a $20 super chat as we look back at pad 2 and pad 1 just off to the right there, following a very successful Starship flight by the majority of the milestones that they had out in front of them. Looks like the road is back open again. See some vehicle traffic down there now. Parker with a $10 super chat says, keep up the great work, Spaceflight Now. Thank you, Parker. Deborah Moore with another $20 super chat. Thank you so much, Deborah. And Whiterun City Guard with a $5 super chat saying, beautiful launch coverage, Spaceflight Now team. Keep up the good work. Thank you all for the kind words and for the support this evening. And that, my friends, will do it for our coverage of Starship Flight 13. Want to thank the team who's been working hard not only on the launch coverage today, but in the run-up to the attempt last week and in the time in the interim. Lots been going on behind the scenes to make sure we kept things moving along. So big thanks to our Adam Bernstein down there at Starbase, and to our team here in Florida, John Pisani and Stephen Young. Also want to give a shout out and a thank you to our friends over at Avid Space, formerly Lab Padre, for their support with some stellar reviews from Starbase, both before and after launch. And you can check them out both over at their YouTube channel. I believe their handle is Lab Padre, but you can find them by searching for Avid Space, and view of Starbase from their cameras, also part of our 24/7 live stream, Launchpad Live. I want to thank our moderators in the chat who've been helping us out throughout the course of the coverage. Thanks to Jeff Hansen and to M. Teresa for helping us out in the live chat, and to channel member Cumulus Granatus for answering folks' questions in the chat as well. Also to Jules for popping in as well, one of our other moderators this evening. Big thanks as well, as always, to you, dear viewer. We know there are lots of places to go when it comes to live launch coverage, and we certainly appreciate your time and attention and being with us this evening. And if you've not got your fill of launch coverage just yet, of course, the weekend is on the horizon, and in just a little less than 14 hours, a Falcon 9 rocket is set to lift off from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with another batch of 24 Starlink V3 mini satellites heading up into orbit. We'll have live coverage of that beginning about 30 minutes prior to liftoff. For all of us here at Spaceflight Now, I am Will Robinson Smith. Remember, be good to yourselves, be good to others. We will see you next time, folks. And until then, thanks for tuning in, and bye-bye.